Chapter 1. "You'll be the belle of the season, miss," Betsy had assured Laura that morning, cinching her corset with practiced efficiency until her waist measured a fashionable 18 inches. Laura had said nothing, merely watched in the mirror as her body was transformed into the ideal silhouette, the Gibson girl hourglass that society demanded. Once Betsy had left, Laura pressed her forehead against the cool window glass. Beyond the window, the Potomac River glinted in the distance, a ribbon of silvered blue beneath the April sky. Beyond it, somewhere across that water, lay Washington City, where her father spent his days in the marble halls of the Capitol, wielding influence and power that extended far beyond their comfortable estate. She watched a ship navigate the river. Where was it going? Somewhere north, where the cities grew even larger and more crowded, or perhaps south, where the air grew thick and sweet with magnolia blossoms. Or west, a voice whispered in her mind. West, where the land stretched wild and untamed. She had devoured every novel she could find about the frontier, stories of pioneers and cowboys, of vast prairies and towering mountains, of danger and freedom. Her mother had confiscated a particularly lurid dime novel last month, declaring it unsuitable for young ladies, but not before Laura had read about a woman who had disguised herself as a man to prospect for gold in California. The very idea had sent a thrill through her that no amount of embroidery or piano practice could match. "Daydreaming again, darling?" Laura turned to find her mother in the doorway, a vision in emerald silk that brought out the green flecks in her hazel eyes. Constance Ashworth moved with the fluid grace. "Just watching the ships, Mama." "Well, come away from the window. You'll ruin your complexion with all that sunlight." Her mother crossed the room, adjusting a vase of hothouse roses on the dresser. The flowers were a deep velvety crimson, and their perfume was almost overwhelming in the closed room. "We have much to do today. The dressmaker is coming at 11 to fit your ball gown for the Harrison Spring Cotillion." Laura's stomach tightened. The cotillion, the first official event of the season, where she would be paraded before Washington's eligible bachelors like a prized heifer at market. Her mother had already made a list of suitable young men: the Vanderbilt boy, young Mr. Cabot from Boston, the railroad magnate's son, all of them wealthy, connected, and utterly predictable. "Yes, Mama," she said, because what else was there to say? Her mother studied her for a long moment, and Laura saw a flicker of something concern, suspicion, cross her delicate features. "You seem distracted lately. Is everything all right?" "I'm fine, Mama. Just thinking about the season." "Oh, darling." Constance's face lit up, and she crossed the room to clasp Laura's hands. "I know you're nervous, but you mustn't be. You're going to be absolutely radiant. Every young man in Washington will be clamoring for your dance card." She leaned in conspiratorially, her breath sweet with peppermint. "Between you and me, I believe the Vanderbilt boy has already expressed particular interest to your father." Laura forced a smile, though inside she felt something wild and desperate clawing at her ribs. The Vanderbilt boy. She had met him once at a dinner party, a pale, pinched young man with watery eyes who had talked at length about his stamp collection. After her mother left in a rustle of silk, Laura sank onto her bed, the mattress soft beneath her. The room felt smaller suddenly, the walls pressing in. She could see her entire future mapped out before her: engagement by summer, a winter wedding, a house in Georgetown or perhaps New York, a lifetime of tea parties and charitable committees, and raising children who would, in turn, be groomed for the same gilded existence. "Is this all there is?" she wondered. "Is this all I'm meant for?" Her gaze drifted to the newspaper folded on her bedside table, her father's discarded copy of the Washington Post. He read it over breakfast each morning, frowning at the political news, then left it in the morning room for the servants to clear away. Laura had taken to sneaking it up to her room, hungry for glimpses of the world beyond their estate. She reached for it now, the paper crackling as she unfolded it.
Her eyes skipped over the headlines, tariff debates, European politics, society announcements, until they landed on a small section near the back, personal advertisements. Most were mundane, rooms for rent, horses for sale, seamstresses offering services. But one caught her eye. Wanted, educated woman of good character for Western household, must be literate in bookkeeping, capable of managing estate, refined manners essential. Lawyer in New Mexico Territory seeks suitable wife. Respond to Box 247, Albuquerque. Laura's heart pounded. New Mexico Territory. She had seen it on maps, that vast expanse of tan and brown, dotted with Spanish names and marked with tiny symbols for mountain ranges and pueblos. It might as well have been the moon for all she knew of it, but the very sound of it, New Mexico, conjured images of adobe buildings baked golden in the sun, of endless skies the color of turquoise, of mysterious cliff dwellings, and yes, perhaps even the chance to see the native peoples who had inhabited those lands for centuries. A lawyer, the advertisement said, not a rancher or a miner or some rough frontiersman, but a professional man, someone who wanted a lady, not just a workhorse, someone who valued education and refinement. He was in New Mexico, the Wild West, as far from Washington society as she could possibly get. Her hands trembled as she carefully tore the advertisement from the page, the small ripping sound loud in the quiet room. She stared at it, reading the words over and over until they burned into her memory. Laura crossed to her bed and lifted her pillow, sliding the small clipping underneath. She pressed the pillow down firmly, hiding her dangerous secret, and tried to ignore the way her heart raced with something that felt remarkably like hope.
Chapter 2. The man who arrived for dinner that Thursday evening came bearing gifts of ill intentions. He was perhaps 45, with a broad, florid face that spoke of too much rich food and brandy. His side whiskers were an unfortunate shade of rust brown, streaked with gray, and his waistcoat strained across a substantial paunch. But it was his eyes that disturbed Laura most, small, pale blue and calculating. They swept over her with the assessing gaze of a man appraising livestock. They traveled over her slowly, deliberately, starting at her face and drifting down across her silk gown in a way that made her skin crawl. "Miss Ashworth, your father did not exaggerate. You are indeed a vision, like a Renaissance painting, all golden hair and rosy youth." "You're too kind, sir," Laura responded, as she had been taught, though she cringed inside. Mr. Ledgehopper smiled, revealing teeth stained yellow from cigars. "I've brought you something, my dear, a small token." He produced a velvet box from his coat pocket and pushed it across the dinner table. Inside the box was a heavy brooch, an enormous, ostentatious thing of rubies and diamonds set in gold, the kind of jewelry that announced wealth rather than taste. Laura stared at it, her throat tight. "I couldn't possibly accept such an expensive gift, Mr. Ledgehopper," she managed. "We've only just met." "Nonsense, I insist." He pressed the box into her hands, his fingers brushing hers. "A beautiful jewel for a beautiful lady, though no gem could match your natural radiance." His thick lips pulled a piece of duck into his mouth. "Tell me, Miss Ashworth," he said, speaking around the duck with savage efficiency, "do you enjoy children?" The question caught her off guard. I suppose so, sir. I haven't had much occasion." "I have 5, Mr. Ledgehopper interrupted. 5 fine boys and girls, though they've been without a mother these past 8 months. Tragic loss, tragic. My dear Beatrice died bringing the youngest into the world." "I'm so sorry for your loss," Laura murmured. "Children need a mother's gentle hand," he continued, his gaze fixed on Laura in a way that made her want to shrink into her chair. "A young, strong woman to guide them, to give them more brothers and sisters, perhaps." His smile widened.
You look to be of hardy stock, Miss Ashworth. Good wide hips, healthy color, fine breeding material." Laura's fork clattered against her plate. Her mother drew in a sharp breath, and even her father looked momentarily shocked. "Mr. Ledgehopper," Constance said, her voice tight with barely concealed outrage, "I hardly think such observations are appropriate dinner conversation." He waved a dismissive hand. "Come now, Mrs. Ashworth, we're all adults here. Well, mostly." He winked at Laura, and she felt bile rise in her throat. "No need for false modesty. Your daughter is clearly a healthy specimen of American womanhood. Any man would be fortunate to— Perhaps we should discuss the upcoming session of Congress, Mr. Ledgehopper," Laura's father cut in, his face flushed beneath his silver hair. "I understand you have interests in the new railway expansion bill." The conversation turned to politics and money. Laura pushed food around her plate, her appetite completely gone. She watched her mother, who sat rigid in her chair, her knuckles white around her fork. Even Constance, with all her social grace and determination, looked disturbed. When the dessert, a lemon cake with vanilla cream, was served, Laura managed only a few bites before setting down her fork. "Mama, I'm feeling rather unwell. May I be excused?" Her mother's eyes met hers, and Laura saw relief there. "Of course, darling, I'll come with you." "No need for both of you ladies to abandon us," Mr. Ledgehopper protested, but Constance was already rising. "I insist. Laura, come. Gentlemen, please excuse us. Thomas, perhaps you and Mr. Ledgehopper might enjoy cigars and port in the study." As they left the dining room, Laura heard her father say, "Shall we discuss your business proposition, Ledgehopper?" In the hallway, her mother touched her arm gently. "Are you truly unwell, or did you simply need to escape that dreadful man?" "Both," Laura admitted, surprised by her mother's candor. Constance's expression softened, and for a moment she looked less like the perfect society matron and more like a woman who understood. "He's not what I would have chosen for you, Laura, but your father says he's extremely wealthy and well-connected. Sometimes we must—" She stopped, shaking her head. "Go on up to bed, darling. I'll see to the kitchen staff." Laura watched her mother disappear down the servants' hallway, the plum silk of her gown swallowing the candlelight. Then she started up the grand staircase. Her legs felt shaky, and the ruby brooch in her pocket, for she had had to accept it to avoid causing a scene, felt heavy as a stone. She had reached the landing when she realized she was desperately thirsty. The idea of going back downstairs was repellent, but her mouth felt dry as cotton, and there was a pitcher of cool water kept in the dining room sideboard. The men should be in the study by now, she reasoned. I could slip in and out without being seen. The house was quiet as she descended, her slippered feet silent on the carpeted stairs. The hallway was dim, lit only by a single lamp on the console table. She could see the golden glow spilling from beneath the dining room door and heard male voices, low and conspiratorial. She should have turned back, should have gone to the kitchen for water instead, but something in her father's tone made her pause just outside the door, her hand frozen on the doorframe. "Generous offer, Ledgehopper, but I'm not sure Laura is ready for—" "Not ready?" Ledgehopper's laugh was harsh, mirthless. "Senator, your daughter is 18. Past time she was married, frankly. Another year or two and she'll be considered a spinster. You know how society talks."
Age? Ledgehopper's voice turned sharp. What does age matter? I'm a man of means, Senator. Substantial means. I own 3 railroads, have interests in steel and oil, properties in New York, Boston, and Philadelphia. Your daughter would want for nothing. There was a pause, the clink of glass on glass. Laura pressed herself against the wall, her heart hammering so hard she was certain they would hear it. "The dowry you mentioned," her father said slowly, and Laura's stomach dropped. 4 times the usual amount. 4 times, yes. $20,000, Senator. Cash, immediately upon marriage. Laura's hand flew to her mouth. $20,000, an enormous sum. And the other matter?
her father asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I have assurances from the party leadership. With my support and the railroad lobby behind you, you'll be Speaker of the House within 6 months of the wedding. Guaranteed. The position is practically yours already. This just ensures it." Silence. Laura could picture her father, weighing his ambition against her daughter's happiness. She knew which would win, even before he spoke. "It's a generous offer, Ledgehopper. More than generous." "Then we have an understanding?" "I would need to discuss it with my wife, of course, and Laura herself should be consulted." "Consulted?" Ledgehopper laughed again, that same unpleasant sound. "Senator, with all due respect, you're her father. You have every right to arrange her marriage as you see fit. What does a girl of 18 know about what's best for her future? They're all just romantic notions and silly dreams at that age." A pause. Then his voice took on a leering quality that made Laura's skin crawl. "Besides, I saw how she looked at the dinner table, all that maidenly modesty and blushing. She'll be compliant enough once we're wed. They always are. And if my dear departed Beatrice is any indication, your daughter's hips are well suited for bearing children. I expect I'll get another 5 or 6 out of her before—" Laura didn't hear the rest. She turned and fled, her hand pressed to her mouth to stifle the sob rising in her throat. Her slippers made soft thuds on the stairs as she ran, her vision blurring with tears. She reached her bedroom and slammed the door, leaning against it as her whole body began to shake. Her face had gone white. She could see it in the mirror across the room, a ghostly apparition with wide, horrified eyes. "They're going to sell me," she thought, and the words echoed in her mind like a death knell, like property, like livestock. Another 5 or 6 children? Before what? Before she died like his first wife, worn out and used up, buried in some cold graveyard while he searched for the next young woman to bear his sons? Her hands trembled as she paced the room, the walls seeming to close in around her. The rose wallpaper, the cream curtains, the perfect furnishings, it all felt like a prison now, pretty bars on a gilded cage. Laura crossed to the window and pressed her forehead against the cool glass. Outside, the moon hung low over the Potomac, painting the water with silver light. Somewhere out there, beyond the river and the city and the carefully manicured world of Washington society, there was another life, a different life. Her gaze drifted to the bed, to the pillow beneath which she had hidden the newspaper clipping. The decision crystallized in that moment, sharp and clear as the moonlight on the water. She would not marry Ivan Ledgehopper. She would not spend her life being leered at and used, bearing child after child until her body gave out. She would not be sold to the highest bidder, bartered like a commodity in exchange for her father's political ambitions. She would do something else, something wild and reckless and utterly terrifying. She would escape.
Chapter 3. The house settled into silence as the hours crept past midnight. Laura waited until she heard her parents retire to their bedroom, heard the distant sound of doors closing and locks turning. She waited until the servants had finished their nightly routines and retreated to their quarters in the attic. She waited until the only sound was the gentle tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway and the whisper of wind against the windows. Then she lit a single candle. The flame sputtered to life, casting dancing shadows across her room. Laura's hands shook as she retrieved the newspaper clipping from beneath her pillow, smoothing it out on her writing desk. The paper was creased from being pressed between pillow and mattress, but the words were still clear. Lawyer in New Mexico Territory seeks suitable wife. She pulled out a sheet of her personal stationery, thick cream paper embossed with her initials in pale blue, and dipped her pen in the inkwell. The nib scratched softly as she touched it to paper, and a small blot of ink spread like a dark flower. Her hand trembled so badly that the first few letters were nearly illegible. She stopped,
took a deep breath, and tried again. Dear Mr. Silverstone, I am writing in response to your advertisement seeking a wife. Though I confess this is the first such letter I have ever written, I hope you will consider my qualifications and find them suitable to your needs. I am 18 years of age, of good health and sound constitution. I have been educated in the finest schools available to young ladies in Virginia and am proficient in literature, history, geography, and mathematics. My penmanship is clear, and I have been trained in bookkeeping and household accounts by my mother, who manages a large estate. I come from a family of some standing and have been raised with the manners and refinement appropriate to managing a gentleman's household. I am capable of directing servants, planning menus, organizing social functions, and maintaining proper accounts. I am told I have a pleasant disposition and am not given to hysteria or vapors. As to my reasons for responding to your advertisement, I long for adventure and a new beginning. The society in which I have been raised feels constraining, and I yearn to see more of this vast country we call home. The territory of New Mexico has captured my imagination, and the opportunity to build a life there, to be part of something new and vital rather than simply maintaining old traditions, appeals to me greatly. I understand that a mail-order arrangement may seem unconventional, particularly for a woman of my background. However, I believe that the frontier requires a different kind of courage than that demanded by society ballrooms. I am willing to leave behind comfort and familiarity for the chance at a partnership built on mutual respect and shared purpose. I am enclosing a photograph so that you may see I am not uncomely. I have been told I am pleasant to look upon, though I leave such judgments to you. Should you find my qualifications acceptable, I would be pleased to correspond further and discuss the practical arrangements of such a union. I understand that New Mexico is far from Virginia and that the life there will be vastly different from what I have known. I am prepared for this change and eager to embrace it. I await your reply with great interest. Most sincerely, Miss Laura Ashworth, daughter of Senator Edmund Ashworth of Virginia. She set down the pen and crossed to her wardrobe, where she kept her small collection of photographs in a leather album. Most were stiff, formal portraits, herself in white dresses, posed in the parlor or garden. But there was one, taken last summer during a rare trip to the Virginia shore. In it, she stood on the beach with the ocean behind her, the wind catching her hair and pulling it free from its pins. The photographer had caught her mid-motion, and unlike her other portraits, this one seemed alive, real. She slid the photograph from the album, studying it in the candlelight. The ocean behind her was a blur of gray and white, the sand pale beneath her feet. Her dress, a simple white cotton frock, was rumpled from the wind, and there were even a few grains of sand visible on the hem. She wrote her address at the bottom of the letter, then sat back and read the letter through 3 times. With each reading, her heart beat faster, and yet the terror she felt was mixed with hope. She folded the letter carefully, slipped it into an envelope along with the photograph, and sealed it with a drop of red wax. Her hands had stopped shaking now, replaced by a strange, giddy certainty. In the morning, she would find a way to post it without her parents' knowledge. Perhaps she could convince Betsy to mail it for her, or slip it into the outgoing post herself when no one was watching. The details didn't matter. What mattered was that she had done it. Laura blew out the candle and sat in the darkness, the sealed envelope pressed against her chest. Outside, the moon had climbed higher in the sky, and the Potomac flowed steadily toward the sea, carrying with it the promise of journeys to unknown shores.
Chapter 4. The New Mexico sun beat down on John Silverstone's so-called estate with the relentless fury of a blacksmith's hammer on an anvil. Heat shimmered up from the hard-packed earth in waves, distorting the horizon until the distant mesas seemed to dance and waver like mirages. The land stretched out in all directions, 10 acres of wind-scoured brown grass, sun-bleached rocks, and thorny scrub brush that clung to life. A single saguaro cactus stood sentinel near the eastern boundary, its arms raised to the cloudless sky as if in surrender to the elements. The property line, if it could be called that, was marked by a strand of rusty barbed wire sagging between spindly cedar posts that leaned at drunken angles, half-rotten and barely standing. When the wind blew, which was often, the wire sang a thin, mournful note that carried across the empty land. The mansion sat in the middle of this desolation like a bad joke. It was a log cabin, perhaps 100 years old, built by some long-dead trapper or missionary who had likely died cursing this God-forsaken territory. The logs had gone gray with age and weather. The gaps between them had been chinked with mud that crumbled a little more each season. The roof was shake shingles, many missing or cracked, patched here and there with pieces of tin that had rusted to the color of dried blood. 2 small windows flanked the front door, one pane cracked, both filmed with dust so thick that looking through them was like peering through dirty water. The cabin consisted of 2 rooms, a front room that served as parlor, dining room, office, and in the back, a bedroom barely large enough for a bed and a chest of drawers. A ladder led up to a loft under the eaves where the summer heat collected. Mice nested in the rafters, and their skittering at night was a constant companion. The recent addition, and Silverstone used that term generously, was a lean-to structure tacked on to the back of the cabin. Its walls were rough-cut pine boards with gaps wide enough to see daylight through, and its roof was more tin patches. It housed a wood cook stove, black and squat and temperamental, and a dry sink with a pump that required 20 hard strokes before it grudgingly produced water the color of weak tea. Behind the cabin, about 30 feet back, stood the privy, a teetering structure that leaned to the left and creaked ominously in the wind. The door hung on leather hinges, with a half-moon carved in the upper panel. Inside, a rough wooden bench with a hole cut in it perched over a pit that drew flies in biblical swarms. A pile of corn husks sat in the corner. This was John Silverstone's empire, his grand estate, the foundation of the lie he had constructed in his advertisement. And at this moment, sitting on the sagging front porch in a ladder-backed chair that had lost half its rungs, Silverstone was smirking. He was a lean man, hard as the land around him, with dark hair slicked back with pomade and a mustache he kept meticulously waxed. His eyes were the color of creek water, murky brown with flecks of green, and they held the perpetual calculation of a man always looking for an angle. He wore a black suit that had seen better days, the fabric shiny at the elbows and seat, but he kept it brushed and his boots polished. Appearances mattered, even out here, where the nearest neighbor was 5 miles away. In his hands he held Laura Ashworth's letter. He had read it a dozen times already, and each reading brought fresh amusement. The cream-colored stationery with its embossed initials, the elegant, educated script, the carefully worded phrases that spoke of refinement and privilege while trying so hard to sound adventurous and bold. Senator's daughter, he thought, his smirk widening, came from money. The photograph had been the real prize, though. He pulled it from the envelope again, studying the image in the harsh afternoon light. A blonde girl, woman, he corrected himself, though 18 seemed impossibly young, standing on a beach with the ocean behind her, her hair loose and wind-blown, her face caught in laughter, her figure clearly visible even in the modest white dress. He set the photograph on the small table beside his chair, next to a glass of whiskey that had gone warm in the heat. He folded the letter carefully and slipped it back into the envelope.
3 months that ad had been running in papers from Boston to Philadelphia, and this was the only damn response he got. But a senator's daughter, that was unexpected. That was interesting. Of course, she could be lying. The whole thing could be a fabrication. The fine stationery purchased to create an impression, the photograph stolen or borrowed from someone else, the claims of education and refinement nothing but fairy tales designed to trap a lonely frontiersman into marriage. Silverstone took a sip of his warm whiskey and grimaced. The taste was harsh, biting, but it helped with the thinking. Did it matter if she was lying? Not really. I didn't need her to actually be educated or refined. I didn't need her to know bookkeeping or how to manage an estate. Hell, there was no estate to manage. What I needed was the appearance of respectability, the facade of normalcy. A respectable man had a wife. A respectable lawyer had a proper household, even if that household was a tumble-down cabin in the middle of nowhere. And a respectable married man was above suspicion. That was the key. Suspicion. Silverstone's practice, as such it was, consisted of drawing up contracts for the occasional minor, settling property disputes, and representing the rare defendant who wandered into the territorial courthouse in Albuquerque. It paid enough to keep him in whiskey and beans, but it wasn't why he came west. The real money, the serious money, came from his other business, arms dealing. The war might have ended back in '65, but out here, the fighting never really stopped. The Apache were still raiding, still fighting against the encroachment of white settlers and the Army's attempts to force them onto reservations. They needed rifles, ammunition, powder, and they were willing to pay, in gold dust panned from hidden streams, in horses stolen from ranches, in information about Army movements.
Then there were the Mexican revolutionaries just across the border, always hungry for weapons to use against whatever government currently held power in Mexico City. They paid in silver, mostly, sometimes in goods smuggled north, tequila, tobacco, the occasional piece of stolen church plate. And the outlaws, Lord, the outlaws. Men like Billy the Kid and his ilk, riding through the territory, leaving a trail of robberies and killings. They needed guns too, and they paid in cash when they had it, stolen goods when they didn't. The Army was cracking down on arms trafficking. There were agents sniffing around, asking questions, following trails. A single man, a bachelor lawyer with no ties and a suspicious amount of cash, attracted attention. Questions got asked, records got examined. But a married man, a lawyer with a wife, a household, the trappings of respectability, that man could conduct his business with far less scrutiny. His cash could be explained as his wife's dowry. His trips into the territory could be framed as escorting his delicate Eastern bride on outings. His visitors could be explained as clients consulting on legal matters. The wife was cover, camouflage, a shield against suspicion. And if she happened to be pretty enough to look at, well, that was just a bonus. Silverstone picked up the photograph again, tilting it to catch the light. Laura Ashworth, standing on a beach somewhere in Virginia, laughing at something beyond the camera's frame. She looked so alive in the image, so full of joy and possibility. Poor little fool, he thought, almost fondly, coming out here looking for adventure and romance. She'd find neither in this cabin, but she'd serve her purpose, whether she liked it or not. He wondered briefly what she'd think when she arrived and saw the reality of his estate. Would she cry, scream, demand to be sent back east on the next stage? Probably, but by then it would be too late. Once she was here, once she was married to him, she'd be trapped as surely as if he'd locked her in the cabin. Women didn't just leave their husbands, not without facing complete social ruin, and a senator's daughter would know that better than most. She'd make the best of it, or she'd make herself miserable trying. Either way, she'd stay. Silverstone stood, draining the last of his whiskey and tucking the letter and photograph into his inside coat pocket. He had things to do, a telegram to send, money to wire. The stage office in Albuquerque would handle the wire transfer.
He'd send her, what? Enough for a train ticket from Virginia to Kansas, then stage fare from there to New Mexico territory, food and lodging along the way. Call it $200 to be safe. A substantial sum, but he could afford it. His last arms deal with the Apache had netted him nearly $1,000. He'd tell her to come immediately. No sense in giving her time to reconsider or for her family to interfere. The sooner she started her journey, the sooner she'd be here, and the sooner he could use her presence to deflect any unwanted attention. Silverstone stepped off the porch, his boots crunching on the hard-packed earth. The cabin looked even more pathetic from this angle, listing slightly to one side, the logs gray and weathered, the whole structure radiating an air of temporary permanence, as if it might blow away in a strong wind. Grand estate, he thought again, and laughed out loud. The sound carried across the empty land and died quickly, swallowed by the vast indifference of the desert. A lizard sunning itself on a rock near the porch scuttled away at the sound, disappearing into a crack between stones. He walked to the small corral behind the cabin, where his horse, a rangy bay gelding named Judas, stood dozing in the shade of the lean-to. The animal's coat was dusty, and flies buzzed around its eyes, but it was sound and strong, necessary qualities for a horse in this country. Silverstone swung into the saddle, settling his weight and gathering the reins. Judas shifted beneath him, eager to move after standing idle all morning. The ride to Albuquerque would take most of the afternoon and into the evening, but he'd make it before the telegraph office closed. And maybe he'd stop at the saloon, have a few drinks, maybe visit the cribs if he was feeling generous with his cash. After all, he was a bachelor for only a little while longer, might as well enjoy his freedom while it lasted. He touched his heels to the horse's flanks, and Judas moved off at an easy lope, heading north toward the town. Behind them, the cabin sat alone in its sea of brown grass and rocks, the sun beating down on its weathered roof, the wind whispering through the gaps in the logs. The wind picked up again, stronger this time, and the rusty barbed wire sang its mournful song to the empty sky. In the distance, storm clouds that might or might not bring rain gathered on the horizon, dark and promising, and ultimately unreliable. Just like everything else in the New Mexico territory. Just like John Silverstone himself.
Chapter 5. The days that followed were a special kind of torture. Laura moved through the house like a ghost, her skin crawling with anxiety, her stomach in constant knots. Every time she heard footsteps in the hallway, her heart leaped into her throat. Was it a messenger with a telegram? Had word come? Or was it just another servant going about their duties, oblivious to the fact that their young mistress was slowly unraveling like a poorly stitched seam? The house itself had transformed into a whirlwind of activity. Her mother was in her element, directing the preparations for the announcement ball with the precision of a general marshaling troops. Seamstresses came and went in a parade of measuring tapes and fabric swatches. Florists presented arrangements of hothouse roses and lilies. The cook was testing recipes for the elaborate supper that would be served. Duck confit, oysters on the half-shell, champagne aspic that wobbled like pale gold jelly. "The engagement will be announced at the ball," her mother had informed her 3 days after that horrible dinner. Constance had been standing in Laura's doorway, backlit by the hallway lamps, her silhouette sharp and unyielding. "Your father and Mr. Ledgehopper have reached an understanding. The wedding will take place in June, before the summer heat becomes unbearable." June. Less than 3 months away. Laura had nodded mutely, unable to trust her voice. Her mother had taken her silence for maidenly modesty and swept from the room in a rustle of taffeta, leaving behind the scent of lavender and the weight of inevitability. If the telegram doesn't come, Laura thought for the 100th time, if Silverstone doesn't respond, I'll have to run anyway. I'll go to Boston or New York and find work as a governess or a shop girl. I'll change my name. But she knew these were the desperate fantasies of a trapped animal.
A senator's daughter couldn't simply disappear into anonymity. Her father had too many connections, too much reach, and what respectable family would hire a governess who had run away from home? What shop would employ a girl with no references, no experience, no explanation for her circumstances? The telegram was her only real hope, and with each passing day, that hope felt more and more like a fool's dream. The park outing had been her mother's idea. "You should spend time with the children," Constance had said over breakfast on Saturday morning, her voice bright with forced cheer. "Get to know them before the wedding. They'll be your responsibility soon enough." Laura had stared at her mother across the white linen cloth top, at the delicate china cups filled with steaming coffee, at the perfectly arranged plate of buttered toast and marmalade. "Must I?" she'd asked quietly. Her father had looked up from his newspaper, his expression stern. "It's already arranged. Mr. Ledgehopper will meet you at Riverside Park at 2. You'll be chaperoned by your maid, of course." Of course, because propriety had to be maintained, even as they sold her to a man old enough to be her father. Betsy had accompanied her in the carriage, sitting across from Laura in her gray servant's dress, her round face worried. Betsy was only 22, just 4 years older than Laura, and they'd grown up together. Betsy starting as a scullery maid when she was 12, Laura the spoiled only child who'd sneaked down to the kitchen to steal cookies and gossip with the staff. "Are you all right, Miss Laura?" Betsy had asked, as the carriage rattled toward the park, her chin dipped, turning her eyes into shadowed pools of concern. "I'm fine," Laura lied, clutching her reticule so tightly her knuckles went white. Inside the small beaded bag was a handkerchief, a few coins, and, hidden in the lining, the carefully folded newspaper clipping and a copy of her letter to John Silverstone. She'd made Betsy swear to secrecy about the letter, and the girl had agreed, though her eyes had been wide with concern. "You won't tell anyone," Laura had pressed. "If a telegram comes for me, you'll bring it directly to me, not to Mother or Father." "I promise, miss, on my honor." Betsy had squeezed her hand. "But are you sure this is wise? A man you've never met, all the way in New Mexico territory?" "It can't be worse than Ledgehopper," Laura had whispered. Now, as the carriage pulled up to Riverside Park, Laura wished she'd stayed home and faced whatever punishment her parents would have devised. The park was lovely in the spring sunshine, weeping willows draping their branches over the Potomac, flower beds bursting with tulips and daffodils in shades of crimson, butter yellow, and cream. Couples strolled along the gravel paths, and children played near the fountain, their laughter carrying on the breeze. And there, near a cluster of oak trees, stood Yvonne Ledgehopper with his 5 children. Laura's stomach dropped. The oldest was a boy of 8, tall for his age and gangly, with his father's rust-brown hair and a mean set to his mouth. The next 3 were boys as well, ages 5, 4, and 2, each one a smaller, grubbier version of the one before. They were dressed in knickers and jackets, but already the youngest boys had dirt on their knees and faces. The baby, 8 months, was held by a tired-looking nursemaid, a girl barely older than Betsy, with a flour sack dress and haunted eyes. "Miss Ashworth," Ledgehopper called out, his voice booming across the park. Several people turned to look. "Come, come, meet your future family."
Laura forced herself to walk forward, Betsy trailing behind her. She was wearing a walking dress of pale lavender silk with cream lace at the collar and cuffs, her hair pinned up beneath a matching hat. She'd taken extra care with her appearance that morning, armor against the ordeal ahead. "Children, this is Miss Laura Ashworth, who will soon be your new mother." Ledgehopper beamed as if he were presenting a prize. "Laura, these are my boys, William, Charles, Henry, and little Theodore. And this," he gestured to the baby, "is Beatrice, named for her poor departed mother." The boys stared at her with identical expressions of calculation. William, the oldest, smiled slowly,
and it wasn't a nice smile. "Pleased to meet you," Laura said, her voice barely above a whisper. "She talks funny," Charles announced, "like she's got a stick up her—" "Charles!" Ledgehopper's voice cracked like a whip. "Mind your manners." But he was smiling indulgently, as if the boy's rudeness were somehow charming. The afternoon descended into chaos almost immediately. The boys had no interest in polite conversation or gentle park activities. William suggested they play a game near the fountain, and before Laura could protest, she was surrounded by running, shrieking children. Charles accidentally bumped into her, causing her to stumble into Henry, who had conveniently positioned himself near a muddy patch. Her hem dragged through the mud, the pale lavender silk turning a sickly brown. "Oh, I'm so sorry, Miss Ashworth," Charles said, his voice dripping with false contrition. "I didn't see you there." "It's quite all right," Laura managed, her face burning as other park visitors stared. Theodore, the 2-year-old, had a piece of chewing gum that he'd been working on for what must have been hours. When Laura bent down to adjust her muddy skirts, he reached up with sticky fingers and grabbed a handful of her hair, the gum transferring from his mouth to her carefully styled waves. "Oh no, Miss Laura," Betsy gasped, trying to untangle the mess, but the gum was thoroughly embedded, and the more they pulled, the worse it became. Ledgehopper watched all of this with detached amusement, offering no help. "Boys will be boys," he said with a shrug. "You'll get used to it." The nursemaid, looking desperate, thrust baby Beatrice into Laura's arms. "I need to use the necessary, ma'am, just for a moment." Before Laura could protest, the girl fled, and Laura was left holding a squirming, fussing infant who smelled distinctly of sour milk and worse. The baby's diaper was clearly wet. Laura could feel the dampness seeping through the child's gown and onto her own lap. She tried to hold the baby away from her body, but Beatrice began to wail, her face turning red and scrunched. "Bounce her," Ledgehopper suggested, unhelpfully. "She likes to be bounced." Laura bounced awkwardly, and the baby's wailing intensified. Then, with a horrible gurgling sound, Beatrice spit up, a stream of curdled milk that splattered down the back of Laura's dress, soaking into the silk and dripping onto the bench. The smell was overwhelming: sour milk, wet diaper, and beneath it all something else that Laura didn't want to identify. She felt her gorge rise and had to swallow hard against the nausea. The boys, delighted by this turn of events, began to laugh and point. "She's got baby sick on her," William crowed. "Look at Miss Fancy Britches. She's covered in baby sick." "Puddles!" Henry shouted gleefully. "Princess Puddles! She's got puddles everywhere, mud puddles and pea puddles." The nickname caught on immediately, and within moments all 4 boys were chanting it. "Princess Puddles! Princess Puddles! Princess Puddles!" Laura felt tears burning in her eyes. Her dress was ruined, mud on the hem, gum in her hair, a wet spot spreading across her lap, baby vomit down her back, and the children circling her like wolves, their taunts growing louder and crueler. "That's enough," she said, her voice shaking, but they didn't stop. If anything, they grew bolder, dancing just out of reach, chanting their horrible nickname. "Bet she cries like a little baby," Charles said. "Bet she runs home to her mama. Princess Puddles is gonna cry like a little baby." Ledgehopper finally intervened, but even then his voice held more amusement than reproach. "Boys, boys, that's no way to treat your new mother. Apologize to Miss Ashworth." They mumbled apologies that were clearly insincere, still smirking at each other. When the nursemaid finally returned and took the baby shrieking back, Laura stood on trembling legs. "I'm afraid I must go," she said, her voice barely controlled. "I'm unwell." Of course, Ledgehopper kissed her hand, seemingly oblivious to her distress. "We'll do this again soon. The children need to get accustomed to you." Never, Laura thought as she fled toward the waiting carriage, Betsy hurrying beside her. In the carriage, with the door safely closed and horses pulling away from the park, Laura finally let the tears come. They streamed down her face, hot and bitter, while Betsy held her hand and made soothing noises. "It's all right, miss. It's all right." But it wasn't all right. Nothing was all right.
Chapter 6. When they arrived home, Laura ran straight to her room, ignoring her mother's shocked exclamation at her appearance. She flung herself on her bed, sobbing into the embroidered coverlet, her whole body shaking. Her mother appeared in the doorway moments later, taking in the ruined dress, the gum-matted hair, the smell of baby fluids and mud. What on earth happened? Laura told her, the words tumbling out between sobs. The boys and their pranks, the gum, the mud, the baby, the horrible nickname they'd given her. Constance sat on the edge of the bed, her hand resting lightly on Laura's back. For a moment, Laura hoped, prayed, that her mother would say this was unacceptable, that she wouldn't force Laura to marry into such chaos. Instead, Constance said quietly, "It could be worse, darling." Laura lifted her head, staring at her mother through tears. How? How could it possibly be worse? You could be marrying a poor man with no prospects. You could be facing life in a tenement or a farm. At least Mr. Ledgehopper can provide for you. At least you'll have servants to help with the children. I don't want servants to help with those horrible children. I don't want to marry him at all. Her mother's face hardened, her jaw setting in a line Laura recognized from her father. Sometimes we don't get what we want, Laura. Sometimes we must do our duty. Your father has made arrangements that will benefit our entire family. You will marry Mr. Ledgehopper, and you will make the best of it. But Mother, that's enough. Constance stood, smoothing her skirts. I'll send Betsy up with hot water so you can bathe. Try to compose yourself before dinner, and we'll need to cut that gum out of your hair. She left, closing the door behind her with a soft click that felt as final as a coffin lid. The telegram arrived the next afternoon. Laura was in the parlor, pretending to embroider while her mother entertained callers, Mrs. Harrison and her daughter Eliza, come to discuss the upcoming ball. The women's voices washed over her like meaningless noise as she stabbed her needle through the linen, her stitches crooked and uneven. Betsy appeared in the doorway, her face carefully neutral. "Miss Laura, you have a message. The boy just brought it from town." Laura's heart stopped. She looked up, meeting Betsy's eyes, and saw the slight nod. "Thank you, Betsy." Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, too high, too bright. "If you'll excuse me, Mother, I need to attend to this." Constance barely glanced up from her tea. "Of course, dear." Laura followed Betsy into the hallway, her hands shaking so badly she could barely take the telegram envelope. They hurried to the servants' staircase, hidden from view, and Laura tore it open with trembling fingers. The message was brief, typed in the characteristic all capitals of telegraph communication. "Funds wired. Stop. Come immediately. Stop. Await your arrival. Stop. Silverstone." Laura read it 3 times, her heart pounding so hard she thought she might faint. "Miss Laura?" Betsy's voice was worried. "What does it say?" "He wants me to come, immediately." Laura looked up at her maid, her friend, and felt tears prick her eyes, but these tears were different than the ones she'd shed yesterday. These were tears of relief, of hope, of terrified excitement. "I'm leaving, Betsy. I'm actually leaving." "Oh, miss," Betsy's eyes were wide. "Are you certain? Once you go, there's no coming back." "I'm certain." And she was. The alternative was Princess Puddles, eternal mother to 5 horrible children, wife to a man who made her skin crawl. "Will you help me?" Betsy hesitated only a moment before nodding. "Of course I will. What do you need?" They planned in whispers on the servants' staircase, their voices barely audible. Laura would leave before dawn, slipping out while the house still slept. Betsy would help her pack a small trunk, just the essentials, nothing that would be missed right away.
and she would take food from the kitchen, enough for the journey. I'll write a letter to my parents. I'll tell them not to worry, that I'm safe. I'll send it once I'm settled so they can't stop me. That night, after dinner, a meal Laura could barely eat, her stomach churning with nerves and excitement, she returned to her room and began to pack. 2 dresses, she decided, her most practical ones, a brown wool traveling dress and a dark blue cotton bay dress, undergarments, stockings, a nightgown, her warmest shawl, a spare pair of boots, a hairbrush, pins, her toiletries. She stood before her wardrobe, looking at the silks and satins, the ball gowns and afternoon dresses, the delicate slippers and fancy hats. All of it represented the life she was leaving behind, a life of privilege and comfort and suffocating expectation. She would miss none of it. Well, perhaps her books. She selected 3 from her small library, a volume of poetry, Jane Eyre, and a collection of essays by Emerson. They would have to be enough. The photograph album she left behind, those memories belonged to a different Laura, a girl who still believed she could be happy in her gilded cage. Betsy smuggled food from the kitchen after the staff had gone to bed. Bread wrapped in cloth, a wedge of cheese, dried apples, strips of jerky that Cook had been saving, a small canteen that could be refilled along the way. At midnight, Laura sat at her desk and began to write. Dearest Mother and Father, by the time you read this, I will be gone. Please do not worry about me, and please do not try to find me. I'm safe, and I'm making my own choice, perhaps the first real choice I have ever made.
I cannot marry Mr. Ledgehopper. I know you believe this match is best for me, best for our family, but I would rather face an uncertain future than a certain misery. I am not built for the life you have planned for me, no matter how comfortable or secure it might be. I am going west to New Mexico Territory to marry a lawyer named John Silverstone. I know you will think me foolish and reckless, and perhaps I am, but I would rather be foolish and free than wise and caged. Please forgive me for the pain this will cause you. I love you both, and I am grateful for everything you have given me, but I must choose my own path now, even if that path leads far from everything I have known. Once I am settled and married, I will write to you with my address. Perhaps someday you will understand why I had to do this. Your loving daughter, Laura. She folded the letter carefully and left it on her pillow, weighted down with the ruby brooch Ledgehopper had given her. Let them have it back. She wanted no reminder of that horrible man. Then she lay in her bed, fully dressed beneath the covers, and waited for dawn. Sleep was impossible. Her mind raced, crafting elaborate fantasies about her new life, her future husband. John Silverstone. Even his name sounded strong, dependable. A lawyer in the territory. That meant he was educated, civilized, yet brave enough to build a life on the frontier. She imagined him tall and broad-shouldered, with kind eyes and a gentle smile. Perhaps he had dark hair like her father, or maybe he was fair like the heroes in her novels. In her mind, she built him into a figure of romance, a man who would appreciate her intelligence and education, who would treat her as a partner rather than property. He would have a beautiful home, not a mansion like the ones in Washington, but something warm and welcoming, with hand-hewn beams and a fireplace where they would sit together in the evenings, reading and talking. There would be books in his library, law books certainly, but also literature and poetry. They would discuss philosophy and current events. He would value her opinions, encourage her thoughts. And he would be handsome. In her fantasy, he looked rather like the illustration she'd seen in a magazine, tall and lean, with chiseled features, strong jaw, eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled, like a hero from a dime novel, noble and true, and utterly devoted to her. They would have children eventually, but not right away. First, they would have time to know each other, to build a life together. And when children did come, they would be nothing like Ledgehopper's horrible brood. They would be well-mannered and curious, eager to learn, respectful. She would learn to manage a frontier household, to adapt to the challenges of the West. Perhaps she would even see real Indians, though from a safe distance. There would be adventures, riding through canyons, watching thunderstorms roll across the plains, attending barn dances where everyone knew everyone and life was simple and honest. It would be hard work, certainly, but it would be her work, her choice, her life. The fantasy sustained her through the endless dark hours until finally, the windows began to lighten with the first hint of dawn. Laura rose silently, her heart pounding. She pulled on her brown traveling dress, buttoned her boots, pinned her hair beneath a simple bonnet. Her small trunk sat by the door, packed and ready. The food bundle was wrapped in a shawl, easy to carry. She took one last look around her bedroom, the rose wallpaper, the cream curtains, the vanity where she'd spent so many mornings preparing herself to be the perfect daughter. She felt no regret. The house was silent as she crept down the servant's staircase, her trunk carefully maneuvered to avoid bumping the walls. Betsy was waiting for her in the kitchen, dressed in her day clothes, her face pale in the dim light of a single candle. "I'll walk with you to the edge of the property," Betsy whispered. "After that, you're on your own." "Thank you for everything," Laura breathed. They slipped out the kitchen door into the gray, pre-dawn world. Fog rolled off the Potomac, thick and silver, muffling sound and obscuring sight. It was like moving through a dream, the familiar landscape transformed into something mysterious and unreal. The train station was a mile away, through the fog and the sleeping streets. Laura's trunk grew heavier with each step, but she didn't slow down, couldn't slow down. Behind her was everything she'd ever known: comfort, security, family. Ahead was the unknown, vast and terrifying and full of possibility. "Once she am settled and married, I will write to you with my address. Perhaps someday you will understand why I had to do this." At the property line, Betsy stopped, her eyes shining with tears. "Be safe, Miss Laura, and if it doesn't work out, if you need help, you write to me, you hear? I'll find a way to help you." Laura hugged her fiercely. "I'll write when I can. Thank you for being my friend." Then she turned and walked into the fog, her trunk banging against her leg, her heart racing with fear and excitement in equal measure. The train station materialized out of the mist like a ghost building, brick and iron, and the smell of coal smoke. Already the early morning train was preparing to depart, its whistle piercing the fog with a long, mournful cry. Laura bought her ticket with the money Silverstone had wired, the clerk barely glancing at her, too tired to question why a young lady was traveling alone at dawn. She climbed aboard, found a seat in the ladies' car, and pressed her face to the window. The train lurched forward, and Virginia began to slip away, the fog, the river, the city, everything she'd ever known disappearing into the distance. The fantasy she'd built in her mind glowed warm and bright as the train carried her west to a future that would be nothing, absolutely nothing like she imagined. But she didn't know that yet. For now, she only knew hope.
Chapter 7. The train journey west had been a revelation and an ordeal. Laura watched through the grimy window as Virginia's gentle green hills gave way to the flatter lands of Tennessee, then the wide, muddy expanse of the Mississippi, then Kansas with its endless prairie grass that rolled like a golden ocean beneath an impossibly vast sky. With each passing mile, the landscape grew stranger, harder, more foreign to her eastern eyes. The trees disappeared first, replaced by low scrub and grasses that seemed to cling desperately to the earth. Then the green itself began to fade, giving way to browns and tans and a dozen shades of dust. The air that seeped through the train car's ill-fitted windows turned dry, sucking the moisture from her skin and lips until they cracked and bled. By the time they crossed into New Mexico territory, Laura felt as though she'd entered another world entirely, perhaps even another planet. The land here was naked, stripped down to bone and sinew. Red mesas rose from the earth like ancient fortresses, their layered stone glowing crimson and orange in the slanting afternoon light. Sagebrush tumbled across the prairie, pushed by winds that never seemed to cease. The sky stretched overhead in a blue so deep and clear it hurt to look at, unmarred by the haze and humidity she'd known all her life. The towns they passed, if they could be called towns, were weathered and temporary-looking, as if the wind might blow them away at any moment. Adobe buildings, the color of the earth itself, wooden structures bleached gray by the relentless sun, streets that were nothing more than packed dirt, rutted by wagon wheels. And the dust, dear God, the dust was everywhere. It seeped into the stage car despite closed windows, coating every surface with a fine grit that crunched between her teeth and stung her eyes. It settled on her dress, her skin, her hair. She could taste it with every breath, dry and mineral, tinged with sage and something else she couldn't identify. The smell of the desert itself, perhaps, ancient and unforgiving. The other passengers had changed, too, as they traveled west. The well-dressed merchants and their wives had gradually disembarked, replaced by miners in rough clothes, cowboys with sun-darkened faces and distant eyes, women in faded calico who looked decades older than they probably were. A Mexican family had boarded in Santa Fe, their rapid Spanish a musical backdrop to the train's rhythmic clatter. Laura had stared at them covertly, fascinated by the mother's black rebozo and the way the children's dark eyes watched everything with sharp intelligence. She'd changed into her best dress in the tiny washroom at the last stop, a gown of deep burgundy silk with black velvet trim, slightly crushed from being packed, but still respectable. She'd sponged the dust from her face and arms with water from the basin, pinned up her hair as best she could, pinched her cheeks to bring back some color. Looking at herself in the small spotted mirror, she'd barely recognized the woman staring back. Her face was thinner, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion and fear. The delicate senator's daughter from Virginia seemed like a character from a half-remembered dream. Now, as the stage lurched to a halt at the Albuquerque station, Laura pressed her face to the window one last time, her heart hammering against her ribs. "This is it," she thought. "This is the moment everything changes." She gathered her carpetbag with trembling hands, smoothed her skirts, and stepped out into the New Mexico afternoon. The heat hit her like a physical blow. It was nothing like Virginia's humid summer warmth. This was a dry, baking heat that seemed to radiate up from the very ground, shimmering in waves above the dirt street. The sun blazed overhead in a blue so deep and clear it hurt to look at, unmarred by the haze and humidity she'd known all her life. The station platform was chaos. People surged around her, cowboys in wide-brimmed hats and jingling spurs, Mexican women with baskets balanced on their heads, miners still covered in rock dust, businessmen mopping their brows with handkerchiefs. The babble of voices was overwhelming, English and Spanish and languages she didn't recognize, all mixing together in a cacophony that made her head spin.
The smell was equally overwhelming. Horse manure and human sweat, the acrid tang of coal smoke, dust and leather and something cooking, chilies maybe, or roasting meat. Underlying it all was that same dry, sage-scented desert smell that had seeped into the train car. The buildings surrounding the station were adobe, thick-walled structures in shades of tan and cream, their flat roofs so different from the pitched ones she knew. Wooden posts supported covered walkways where people clustered in the shade, fanning themselves. Dogs wandered freely, tongues lolling, and chickens pecked in the dust near an alley. In the distance, beyond the town, the land stretched out in waves of brown and gold toward mountains that rose purple against the horizon. Closer, she could see a church, its white walls and bell towers stark against the endless blue sky. Laura scanned the crowd, her carpetbag clutched in one hand, her heart in her throat.
She had no idea what Silverstone looked like. No photograph had accompanied his advertisement or his telegram. For all she knew, he could be anyone in this sea of strange faces. Then the crowd parted, and a man stepped forward. "Miss Ashworth?" Laura's first reaction was a jolt of surprise that she barely managed to hide. John Silverstone was not the man she had imagined. He was perhaps 35, lean rather than broad-shouldered, with dark hair slicked back with so much pomade it gleamed like polished wood in the sunlight. His mustache was waxed into sharp points that curled upward at the ends, a style she'd never seen in Virginia, where men favored more natural facial hair. It gave him a theatrical appearance, almost comical. His suit was black and well-tailored, she had to give him that. The coat fitted properly across his shoulders, the trousers creased. But even her untrained eye could see it was several years out of fashion, the lapels a style that had been popular when she was barely into her teens. And there, at the elbows and seat, the fabric was worn, smooth, and shiny from use. His eyes were brown with flecks of green, sharp and assessing as they traveled over her. His smile revealed good teeth at least, though there was something about the way his lips curved that made her uneasy, too calculated, too practiced. "Mr. Silverstone?" she managed, her voice sounding small and uncertain. "The very same." He swept off his hat, also slightly outdated, and gave a small bow. "Welcome to New Mexico territory, Miss Ashworth. I hope your journey wasn't too arduous." "It was educational," she said, because what else could she say? He laughed, a sharp bark of sound. "Educational. Yes, I suppose it would be for a lady of your refinement." He reached for her carpet-bag. "Allow me. Do you have a trunk?" "Yes, it should be with the baggage." They retrieved her small trunk, the porter looking at her with open curiosity, clearly wondering what a well-dressed Eastern lady was doing in Albuquerque. And Silverstone arranged for it to be delivered to the hotel. Then he offered his arm. His forearm beneath the worn fabric was wiry, tense. He smelled of cigars and hair pomade, with an underlying scent of sweat that no amount of cologne could quite mask. "I thought we might dine at the hotel before we attend to our business," he said as they walked, his voice pitched low and conspiratorial. "Give you a chance to refresh yourself after your journey. The Palace Hotel serves the finest cuisine in Albuquerque, which admittedly isn't saying much compared to what you're used to, but it's respectable." "That's very kind," Laura murmured, trying not to stare at everything around her. They crossed the dusty street, Laura lifting her skirts to avoid the worst of the dirt and what looked distressingly like horse droppings, and approached a two-story building with a painted sign, the Palace Hotel. It was wood frame rather than adobe, painted white though the paint was peeling in places, with a wide porch where several men sat in rocking chairs, smoking and watching the street with hooded eyes. One of them called out something in Spanish as they passed, and Silverstone's hand tightened on her elbow. "Pay them no mind," he muttered. Inside, the hotel was marginally cooler, though still stifling by Virginia standards. The lobby was small but a tempting grandeur, wallpaper in a dark red pattern, furniture that aspired to elegance but fell short, a chandelier that might have been impressive before half its crystals went missing. A large painting of a nude woman hung behind the desk, and Laura quickly averted her eyes, her face heating.
The dining room was similarly appointed, round tables covered in white cloths that weren't quite clean, chairs with worn velvet seats, heavy curtains drawn against the afternoon sun. About half the tables were occupied, mostly by men in various states of frontier dress. The few women present wore clothes that Laura instinctively knew marked them as not respectable: bright colors, low necklines, painted faces. Silverstone led her to a corner table and held her chair with exaggerated courtesy. A Mexican waiter appeared almost immediately, his white jacket stained with what looked like gravy. "Senor Silverstone, welcome back.
And who is this beautiful señorita? My intended bride, Miss Laura Ashworth, fresh from Virginia. Silverstone smiled broadly, and Laura noticed that several nearby diners had turned to stare. We're celebrating, Miguel, your finest service tonight. Of course, Miguel bowed low. For you, señor, only the best. Champagne, perhaps? Let's see the menu first. My bride may have anything her heart desires. Price is no object. The offerings were a strange mix of familiar and foreign. Beefsteak, roasted chicken, something called chile verde, enchiladas, beans and rice. The prices were listed beside each item, and Laura couldn't help but notice Silverstone's eyes tracking them as she read. The chicken looks nice, Laura said finally, choosing something in the middle price range. Excellent choice. I'll have the same. Silverstone closed his menu with a snap. And 2 glasses of ice water, Miguel. None of that warm business. After dinner, Silverstone pulled out a thin cigar, not the thick, expensive kind her father smoked, but something cheaper, with a harsh smell when he lit it. He blew smoke toward the ceiling and leaned back in his chair, studying her. So, tell me, Miss Ashworth, what made a senator's daughter answer an advertisement from a frontier lawyer? Laura hesitated. I wanted adventure, something different from the life that was planned for me. I see. He took a long drag on his cigar. And what do you bring to this union, Miss Ashworth, besides your obvious charms, of course? I can manage a household. I'm educated in literature and mathematics. I can keep accounts, as I mentioned in my letter. I'm a hard worker and quick to learn. Tell me about your practice, your legal work. What sort of cases do you handle? Oh, the usual frontier business. Land disputes, claim jumping, the occasional theft or assault. Nothing too exciting. He waved his hand dismissively. It pays the bills, keeps food on the table. And your estate? It's a modest but comfortable, about 10 acres outside of town. Peaceful, quiet. You'll like it. Silverstone stubbed out his cigar and leaned forward, his expression suddenly intense. Miss Ashworth, Laura, if I may, I have a proposal. There's a chapel here in town, a proper minister. We could be married tonight before the sun sets. Then tomorrow we'll head out to the estate and begin our new life together. He reached across the table and took her hand, his palm slightly damp. Why wait? You've come all this way. The sooner we're wed, the sooner we can start our future. I suppose, Laura sputtered. Excellent. Silverstone stood abruptly, pulling her to her feet. Come, the chapel is just across the street. Within the hour, you'll be Mrs. John Silverstone. He threw some bills on the table and practically dragged her toward the door. They emerged onto the porch into the slanting late afternoon light, the heat still oppressive despite the advancing hour. The chapel was a small whitewashed building with a wooden cross above the door, squeezed between a dry goods store and what looked like a saloon. It was humble but clean, its white paint bright against the dusty street. Silverstone, a strong masculine voice from behind them. They both turned. Laura gasped.
Chapter 8. Standing at the base of the chapel steps was a man unlike any Laura had ever seen. He was Navajo, that much was immediately clear from his copper-red skin and high cheekbones. His black hair fell past his shoulders, held back from his face by a leather band tied around his forehead. He was tall, perhaps 6 feet, with broad shoulders that tapered to a narrow waist and long, powerful legs. And he was nearly naked. Laura's face flamed with heat that had nothing to do with the desert sun. The man wore deerskin leggings that hugged his legs like a second skin and nothing else. His chest was bare, muscles clearly defined, his skin smooth and unmarred except for a few pale scars that looked like they might have come from a knife or claws. She knew she should look away, that staring was unforgivably rude, but she couldn't seem to make her eyes obey. She had never seen a man in such a state of undress. Even her father's bare forearm had been considered shocking in polite society. This man was beautiful, her mind supplied traitorously, and she felt her flush deepen. Cash,
Silverstone's voice was tight, annoyed. "I'm in the middle of something." "I can see that." The Navajo man, Cash, looked at Laura with open curiosity, his eyes traveling over her in a way that should have been insulting but somehow wasn't. There was intelligence in those dark eyes, and humor. "This the mail-order bride?" "This is my intended wife, Miss Laura Ashworth." Silverstone's emphasis on intended wife was sharp. "Laura, this is Cash, a business associate of mine." Cash inclined his head slightly, a gesture that was somehow both respectful and mocking. "Pleased to meet you, Miss Ashworth." His English was perfect, unaccented, which surprised her. "Mr. Cash?" she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Just Cash." His eyes stayed on her face. "You come all the way from Virginia?" "How did you that I came from Virginia?" "Silverstone talks." Cash shifted his weight, and muscles moved beneath his skin in a way that made Laura's mouth go dry. She looked away quickly, focusing desperately on a spot over his shoulder. What was wrong with her? She was acting like a silly girl with her first crush. When she dared glance back, she found Cash still watching her, and now there was definite amusement in his expression. He knew exactly the effect he was having on her, and he was enjoying it. "What do you want, Cash?" Silverstone asked tersely. "As you can see, I'm about to get married." "The deal we discussed can wait," Silverstone cut him off with a sharp gesture. "Tomorrow." "Can't wait." Cash's voice was mild, but Laura heard steel underneath. "The people I represent want answers now. Either you can deliver what you promised, or they'll find someone who can." Silverstone's jaw tightened. Then he glanced at her, seemed to calculate something, and forced a smile. "Of course, business before pleasure, as they say." He turned to Laura, his hand dropping from her waist. "My dear, I apologize. A small matter that requires my immediate attention. Would you excuse us for just a moment?" The two men moved a few feet away, their voices dropping to low murmurs. Laura stood on the chapel steps, trying very hard not to stare at Cash's broad shoulders and the way the setting sun cast golden light across his skin. Without conscious thought, she found herself comparing Ivan Ledgehopper with his florid face and substantial paunch, his thick fingers and leering gaze, to John Silverstone with his slicked hair and waxed mustache, lean and sharp-edged like a knife, and Cash, all smooth muscle and quiet confidence, his body speaking of strength and capability in a way that made her heart race. She had never thought about men's bodies before. It wasn't something proper young ladies did. But standing here in the New Mexico heat, watching Cash gesture as he spoke, she found she couldn't think about anything else. The light caught on a silver and turquoise bracelet around Cash's wrist, the only adornment he wore besides the leather headband. His hair was so black it was almost blue in the sunlight, and when he turned his head, she could see the sharp line of his jaw, the elegant column of his throat. "Stop it," she told herself firmly. "This is completely inappropriate." But her eyes wouldn't obey. They traced the line of his collarbone, the plane of his chest, the ridges of muscle across his... She'd seen classical statues in museums, of course, naked marble men posed in heroic stances. But those had been cold and white and safely distant. This was warm flesh and blood, and very, very close. She was so absorbed in her illicit study that she didn't notice the conversation had ended until Cash turned back toward her. His eyes met hers, and she realized with horror that he'd caught her staring. His grin widened, showing white teeth, and one eye closed in a deliberate wink. Laura's face went scarlet. She looked away quickly, mortified beyond words. She'd been caught ogling him like a shop girl eyeing candy in a store window. What must he think of her? What must Silverstone think? But when she dared a glance at her intended, he seemed oblivious, his attention on Cash's departing back. Cash walked away with an easy, rolling gait, completely unself-conscious about his state of undress. Just before he disappeared around the corner of the chapel, he looked back one more time, caught her eye again, and smiled. Then he was gone. Silverstone turned back to her, his expression troubled.
"I'm terribly sorry, my dear, but a business matter has arisen that requires my immediate attention. It can't wait until tomorrow. I'm afraid I must deal with it tonight." "Oh, I see. But," he raised a finger, "this doesn't change our plans, only delays them slightly. I'll arrange a room for you here at the hotel, the best they have. You'll be comfortable, able to rest after your long journey, and first thing in the morning I'll come for you. We'll be married, and then I'll take you home to our estate." "Tomorrow morning," Laura repeated, her mind still half on the image of Cash's retreating form. "Excellent." He took her hand and brought it to his lips. "Rest well, my dear Miss Ashworth. By this time tomorrow you'll be Mrs. Silverstone, and all of this uncertainty will be behind you." He escorted her back to the hotel, arranged for a room, and pressed a few bills into her hand. "For your dinner and anything else you might need. I'll see you at 8 o'clock sharp." Then he was gone, striding away into the dusty street, with his outdated suit and his sharp, calculating eyes, leaving Laura alone in a strange hotel in a strange town at the edge of a vast and foreign land. She climbed the stairs to her room in a daze, barely noticing the worn carpet or the peeling wallpaper. The room was small and hot, with a single window that looked out over the street and a bed that sagged in the middle. But it was clean, and it was hers for the night. Laura sat on the edge of the bed and stared at her hands, trying to process everything that had happened in the last few hours. She'd met her future husband. He was not what she'd hoped for, not at all, but he wasn't ledge-hopper either. That had to count for something. And she'd met a nearly naked Navajo man that made her heart race and her face flush and her body respond in ways she didn't quite understand. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The sounds of the town drifted up through her window, laughter from the saloon, the clop of horses' hooves, someone singing in Spanish. Tomorrow, she would become Mrs. John Silverstone. Tomorrow, her new life would truly begin. Laura lay back on the sagging bed and stared at the ceiling, trying to recapture the hopeful fantasy she'd built during those long nights in Virginia. But all she could see was Cash's knowing smile and Silverstone's worn suit and the endless, dusty miles of a land that cared nothing for the dreams of foolish Eastern girls.
Chapter 9. Sleep had been impossible. The room was stifling despite the late hour, the air thick and still, pressing down on her like a wool blanket. Her camise stuck to her skin, damp with perspiration, and no matter how she arranged herself on the lumpy mattress, she couldn't find comfort. But it wasn't just the heat keeping her awake. Her mind raced, thoughts tumbling over each other in an endless, chaotic stream. "It will be fine," she told herself for the 100th time. "It has to be fine. It's certainly better than ledge-hopper." She tried to catalog Silverstone's good qualities, to build a foundation of optimism on which to construct her future. He wasn't ugly, lean rather than fat, with regular features beneath that ridiculous mustache. He was educated, a professional man. He'd been polite at dinner, if a bit brusque, and he'd paid for her journey, arranged for her room, shown consideration for her comfort. "The mustache can be changed," she thought. "Perhaps after we're married I can gently suggest he trim it differently. And the hair, all that pomade is just fashion, isn't it? Styles change. I could help him dress more moderately, introduce him to better tailors. And surely there are better cigars available than those thin, acrid things he smokes." The image made her smile slightly in the darkness. She could picture it, a transformed Silverstone, his hair natural and touchable, his mustache trimmed to something less theatrical, wearing a properly fitted suit in current fashion. They would make a handsome couple. She would learn to manage the household, to cook and clean and do whatever frontier wives did. They would build a life together. But even as she constructed these hopeful scenarios, her treacherous mind kept drifting to other images. Broad shoulders gleaming in the sunset, smooth copper skin stretched over lean muscle,
black hair falling past strong shoulders, dark eyes that sparkled with intelligence and humor. Cash. Laura rolled onto her side, punching the flat pillow in frustration. Why couldn't she stop thinking about him? She'd seen him for all of 10 minutes. He was a complete stranger, a Navajo man who wore barely any clothes and had looked at her with amusement, probably laughing at the silly Eastern girl gawking at him like he was some exotic animal in a menagerie. It was mortifying. It was inappropriate. It was absolutely nothing compared to what she should be thinking about, her imminent marriage, her future, her new life. And yet, she could still see the way the light had caught on his skin, highlighting the curve of muscle, the elegant line of his throat, the way he'd moved with such unconscious grace, completely comfortable in his own body, the way his eyes had met hers, knowing exactly what she was thinking, and that slow, devastating smile. "Stop it," she commanded herself. "Stop it right now. You're getting married tomorrow to John Silverstone, and Cash is nothing to you, a stranger, a momentary fascination brought on by the strangeness of everything. Tomorrow you'll laugh at yourself for being so foolish." But tomorrow felt very far away. The hours crawled past. Laura watched the shadows shift as the moon traveled across the sky. She heard the saloon finally quiet, the last drunken voices fading into silence. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. A wagon rattled past on the street below, its driver singing something in Spanish that sounded sad and beautiful. Finally, when the darkness had just begun to soften toward the gray of pre-dawn, Laura gave up on sleep entirely. She rose from the bed, her nightgown clinging to her damp skin, and crossed to the window. The street below was empty, the buildings dark shapes against the slowly lightening sky. Above, the stars were still brilliant, more stars than she had ever seen in her life, scattered across the heavens in thick swaths of silver. The moon hung low on the western horizon, a pale ghost preparing to surrender to the coming sun. A walk, Laura decided suddenly. She needed a walk to clear her head, to prepare herself mentally for the day ahead. The town was sleeping. Surely she would be safe for a short stroll. She needed to move, to breathe air that wasn't this suffocating hotel room atmosphere. She dressed quickly in the same burgundy dress from yesterday, not bothering with a corset or all the layers of petticoats. Just the dress and her boots, her hair hastily pinned up. She looked a fright, she was sure, but who would see her at this hour? The hotel hallway was silent like a tomb, her footsteps muffled by the worn carpet. She crept down the stairs, past the front desk where a clerk dozed in his chair, and slipped out the front door into the pre-dawn darkness. The heat hit her immediately, and she stopped in surprise. She'd expected coolness. Virginia mornings were always cool, with dew on the grass and a pleasant chill that made you pull your shawl tighter. But here, even in these hours before sunrise, the air was warm and dry, carrying that same dusty, sage-scented smell that seemed to permeate everything. The buildings were dark and shuttered, the town holding its breath in these liminal hours between night and day. A cat slunk across her path, pausing to stare at her with luminous eyes before disappearing into an alley. Laura's thoughts turned to the day ahead, the wedding at the chapel, and after the wedding they would go to the estate. She tried to imagine the estate based on Silverstone's description. 10 acres, that was substantial, wasn't it? A grand house, maybe with a garden or at least space for one. Maybe there would be other women nearby, frontier wives who could teach her what she needed to know. She could make friends, be part of a community. Her spirits were actually lifting as she approached the chapel, its white walls glowing faintly in the darkness. It looked peaceful, almost welcoming. Tomorrow, no, today, she would stand before those doors and become a married woman. Mrs. John Silverstone. The name still felt foreign, but she could grow into it. She would grow into it. She had no other choice, really. But perhaps choice was overrated. Perhaps commitment, dedication, making the best of what you had, perhaps those were more valuable than endless options. Beyond the chapel, she noticed a small grove of trees, sycamores, their pale bark ghostly in the dim light. It was the first real cluster of trees she had seen since arriving, and she was drawn to them like a moth to flame. Trees meant shade during the day, probably some source of water to sustain them, a small oasis in this desert town. She walked toward them, already imagining the relief of standing under their branches. Maybe there would be a breeze, a moment of coolness before the heat of the day began in earnest. The trees were larger than she had thought, their branches spreading wide overhead. Laura stepped into their shadow and immediately felt a difference in the air, not exactly cool, but less oppressive. There was movement in the leaves above, a gentle rustling that was almost musical after the stillness of the street. She closed her eyes, tilting her head back, and reached up to loosen the collar of her dress. The fabric was already beginning to stick to her neck, and she longed for the touch of moving air against her skin. If she could just get some of that breeze. A hand clamped over her mouth, cutting off the gasp before it could form. An iron arm wrapped around her waist, jerking her backward into a body that was all hard muscle and frightening strength. Laura's eyes flew open, her heart exploding into panicked rhythm. She tried to scream, but the hand pressed tighter, muffling everything. She was being dragged deeper into the shadows, her feet barely touching the ground. She struggled, kicking backward, trying to twist free, but whoever held her was far too strong. Another figure emerged from the darkness. Laura caught a glimpse of a second man, his features obscured by shadow, and then hands grabbed her again, lifting her bodily off the ground.
Terror flooded her system, white-hot and overwhelming. She was gonna die. She'd come all this way, left her family, traveled across the country, and now she was going to be murdered in a grove of trees by the very chapel where she was supposed to be married in a few hours. She tried to bite the hand over her mouth, but her captor anticipated it and shifted his grip. She could feel the warmth of his breath against her ear as he bent close. "Don't scream," he growled, and the world tilted sideways. Laura found herself being heaved upward, thrown across something warm and alive that moved beneath her. A horse, she realized instantly, a horse with no saddle, just the heat of its body against her stomach as she was draped across its back like a sack of flour. Her mind struggled to process what was happening. Kidnapping. She was being kidnapped. Oh God, she needed to scream, to fight, to... The horse surged into motion, and Laura grabbed frantically at its mane to keep from sliding off. The man who had grabbed her swung up behind her, his body pressing against her back, one arm like a steel band around her waist, holding her in place. They were moving fast, the horse's hooves churning up dust as they left the grove of trees and headed out into the open desert. Laura could hear other horses, at least two more, their riders keeping pace on either side. The hand finally left her mouth, and Laura dragged in a gasping breath, preparing to scream with everything she had. "I wouldn't," the voice behind her said, and something in its tone made her freeze. She knew that voice. Laura twisted her head, trying to see her captor's face in the growing light. The eastern horizon was beginning to glow now, the first hints of sunrise painting the sky in shades of deep purple and pink. And in that light, she could just make out the features of the man who held her. Copper skin, high cheekbones, black hair streaming behind them in the wind of their passage. "Cash?" The name came out as a whisper, disbelieving. She felt rather than saw his grin. "Morning, Miss Ashworth." Why are you... Her mind couldn't form complete thoughts. Nothing made sense. "You're kidnapping me," she said, the words stupid and obvious, but the only ones her shocked brain could produce. "Looks that way." But why? Where are you taking me?" "Somewhere safe." "Safe? Safe from what?" Her voice was rising now, panic giving way to confused anger. "I was perfectly safe. I was going to be married today. Mr. Silverstone—" "Silverstone's not who you think he is." Cash's voice was grim, "and that wedding would have been the worst mistake of your life." "That's not... You can't just..."
Laura struggled against his grip, but it was like fighting iron. "Let me go! Take me back this instant!" "Can't do that." "Why not? Mr. Silverstone is a respectable lawyer," she said, trying to inject authority into her voice. "He paid for my journey here. He's been nothing but courteous. And you're—" Laura's mind raced. This couldn't be happening. This was insane. She'd been kidnapped by a half-naked Navajo man who claimed to be saving her from what exactly? Her own wedding? "I'm what?" The amusement in his voice now, mixed with something harder. "A savage? A thief?" "I didn't say that." "You were thinking it." Laura opened her mouth to deny it, then closed it again. Hadn't she been thinking exactly that? Hadn't her first assumption been that she was being attacked, murdered, that Cash was some kind of— "Your respectable lawyer," Cash said, his voice cutting through her confused thoughts, "is an arms dealer. He sells guns to whoever will pay. Apache, Mexican revolutionaries, outlaws. He doesn't care who gets killed with those weapons as long as the money's good." That's a lie. He's a lawyer. He told me." "He told you what you wanted to hear. That's what men like Silverstone do." Cash shifted behind her, and Laura became suddenly acutely aware of how close he was, how his chest pressed against her back, how his arm around her waist held her secure, despite the horse's jolting gait. He needed a wife to make him look respectable, to give him cover for his real business. That's all you were to him, a convenient facade. No, but even as she said it, doubts were creeping in. The worn suit, the cheap cigars, the way he'd insisted on marrying her immediately, before she had time to think or question. "No, you're wrong." "Am I?" Cash's breath was warm against her ear. "Then why did he rush you to the chapel the minute you arrived? Why not give you time to rest, to see the estate he supposedly has, to get to know him? But the urgent matter I brought up to him was for him to arrange a shipment of rifles to sell to the Apache, rifles that would be used to kill soldiers, settlers, maybe even people you know." Laura's stomach turned over. She didn't want to believe it. She couldn't believe it, because if it was true, then she'd fled from one nightmare straight into another. She'd left Ledgehopper only to nearly marry a criminal. "Why should I believe you?" she demanded. "You're the one who just kidnapped me." "Fair point. But ask yourself this. If I wanted to hurt you, why go to all this trouble? If I had bad intentions, Miss Ashworth, there were a lot easier ways to accomplish them." The sun was rising in earnest now, spilling golden light across the desert landscape. Laura could see more clearly the two other riders flanking them, both Navajo men, both as nearly naked as Cash, both handling their horses with the same unconscious skill. The land around them was vast and empty, broken only by the occasional twisted tree or outcropping of red rock. The mountains in the distance were turning purple and gold in the sunrise, and the sky overhead was a blue so deep and pure it hurt to look at. Laura closed her eyes, feeling tears of frustration and fear and exhaustion burn behind her lids. How had everything gone so wrong so quickly? "I wanted adventure," she thought bitterly. "Well, I certainly got it."
Chapter 10. Behind her, Cash's body was warm and solid, his arm keeping her secure even as the horse galloped across the rough terrain. She should be terrified. She should be screaming and fighting and doing everything in her power to escape. But instead, exhausted and overwhelmed and completely out of her depth, Laura just held on and let herself be carried across a land as foreign as the moon. Somewhere back there, John Silverstone would wake to find his convenient bride gone. And somewhere ahead, in a place Laura couldn't even imagine, her real adventure was about to begin. They rode hard for what felt like hours, though it was probably less. Laura's body ached from being draped across the horse, her muscles protesting the awkward position. The sun climbed higher, the heat building with each passing minute, and sweat began to trickle down her back beneath her dress. Just when she thought she might actually slide off the horse from pure exhaustion, the landscape began to change. The flat desert gave way to gentle rolling hills, and ahead, Laura could see a line of trees, real trees, not the sparse, twisted things that dotted the plains, but actual cottonwoods and willows that suggested water. "Almost there," Cash said, and Laura felt his grip on her shift slightly, as if preparing to dismount. "Where?" she managed through dry lips. They crested a small rise, and Laura gasped despite herself. Nestled in a copse of trees was a cabin. It was small but well built, with glass windows that caught the morning sun, and a stone chimney that rose from a shingled roof. Around it, cottonwoods provided dappled shade, their leaves rustling in a breeze. And past the cabin, the sound of a creek bubbling and splashing over stones. The most beautiful sound Laura had heard since leaving Virginia. The simple scene looked like something from a storybook, a hidden haven in the middle of this harsh land. Cash brought the horse to a halt near the cabin door and swung down with fluid grace. Then he reached up for Laura. His hand spanned her waist as he lifted her down, and for a moment she was pressed against him, her feet not yet on the ground, their faces level. This close, she could see flecks of amber in his dark eyes, could smell sage and leather. His skin was warm beneath her palms, where she'd instinctively grabbed his shoulders for balance. Then her feet touched the ground, and he stepped back, though his hands remained on her waist for a moment longer, steadying her. "Can you walk?" he asked. Laura's legs were trembling from the ride, but she nodded. "I think so." "Good." He gestured toward the cabin. "Go inside. There's water, food. Make yourself comfortable." "You're not—" She stopped, hating how small her voice sounded. "You're not just kidnap me and then tell me to make myself comfortable? I demand an explanation, right now." Cash studied her for a long moment, and Laura saw him weighing something in his mind. Then he stepped fully inside and closed the door behind him. In the small space of the cabin, he seemed even larger, more imposing. The morning light from the window cast gold across his bare chest, highlighting every line and curve of muscle. Laura forced herself to focus on his face. "Sit down," he said quietly. "I'd rather stand." "Miss Ashworth, sit down." There was steel in his voice now. Something in his tone made her obey. She sank into one of the chairs, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, and waited. Cash pulled out the other chair and straddled it backward, his arms resting on the back. For a moment, he just looked at her, those dark eyes assessing. "What I'm about to tell you cannot leave this cabin, not yet. Do you understand?" Laura's mouth was dry. She nodded. "My name is Cash, that much is true. But I'm not just some Navajo man doing business with Silverstone." He paused. "I'm a spy for the United States government. Have been for 3 years now." Laura stared at him, certain she'd misheard. What?"
"A spy. An intelligence agent, if you prefer fancier words." He leaned forward slightly. "The government has been trying to stop illegal arms trafficking in the territory for years. Men like Silverstone make a fortune selling weapons to anyone who will pay. Apache warriors, Mexican revolutionaries, outlaws. Those guns kill soldiers, settlers, innocent people. We want it stopped." "But you're—" Laura gestured helplessly at his appearance, his state of undress, trying to reconcile this revelation with the half-naked warrior who'd grabbed her in the darkness. "I'm Navajo," he said evenly. "That's not a lie. My mother was Navajo. My father was a white trader. I grew up in both worlds, speak both languages, understand both cultures. Makes me useful to the government. I can go places other agents can't, talk to people who wouldn't trust a white man." Laura's mind was reeling. "So when you met with Silverstone yesterday?" "I was setting a trap. We've been building a case against him for months, gathering evidence, documenting his deals. Yesterday I offered him a big sale, 50 rifles to the Apache, enough to make him careless, to get him to show us his whole operation." Cash's expression hardened. "And then you showed up." "I don't understand. What do I have to do with everything?"
He stood abruptly, began to pace the small cabin like a caged animal. Silverstone needed you, Miss Ashworth. A wife makes a man look respectable, above suspicion. And a senator's daughter? He turned to face her. That's even better. Marry you, use your family connections, your respectability. Who would suspect a man married to Edmund Ashworth's daughter of running guns to hostile Indians? The room seemed to tilt. Laura gripped the edge of the table to steady herself. "He was going to use me," she whispered. "He is using you. The minute he got that telegram saying you were coming, he started telling people about his respectable Eastern bride, started making plans to expand his operation, take bigger risks, because he'd have the perfect cover. You." Laura felt sick. She'd fled from being used by Ledgehopper for breeding stock, only to nearly become a pawn in an arms dealer's criminal enterprise. "Why didn't you just arrest him? Why let it get this far?" "Because we need more than just evidence of one deal. We need to know his whole network, who supplies him, who he sells to, where the money goes. If we arrest him now, the rest of the operation just goes underground and pops up somewhere else." Cash crouched in front of her chair, bringing his eyes level with hers. "But if he thinks everything is normal, if he gets married and comfortable and confident, he'll get sloppy. He'll lead us to everyone." "So what am I supposed to do?" Laura heard the hysteria creeping into her voice. "Just go back? Marry him anyway, knowing what he is?" "No," Cash's voice was firm. "That's why I took you. The original plan was to let the wedding happen, use you as an unwitting asset, but I couldn't." He stopped, seemed to struggle with something. "You didn't sign up for that. You thought you were marrying a respectable lawyer. You don't deserve to be caught in the middle of this." "Then what?" Laura's eyes were burned with unshed tears. "What happens now?" "Now you stay here where it's safe. Silverstone will think you ran away, got cold feet, maybe even that you were taken by hostiles. He'll be furious, but he can't exactly report a missing mail-order bride to the authorities without raising questions." Cash stood, putting distance between them again. "My men will keep watch, make sure no one finds you, and I'll go back to town, continue the operation, finish what we started." "And then what?" "And then, once we have enough evidence and we've arrested everyone involved, I'll take you back to town, put you on a train east if that's what you want, or," he paused, "or help you figure out what comes next if you don't want to go back." Laura looked down at her hands, still clasped tightly in her lap. They were trembling. "I can't go back to Virginia, not after running away. My father, he'll force me to marry Ledgehopper or someone worse. I burned those bridges." "I know." "So I'm trapped, just in a different way than I was before." Cash was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was gentler than she'd heard it yet. "You're not trapped, Miss Ashworth. You're protected. There's a difference." He moved toward the door. "Rest. Eat something. I'll be right outside if you need anything, and I promise I won't let anything happen to you." "Why?" The question burst out before she could stop it. "Why do you care what happens to me? You could have just let me marry him, used me like everyone else wants to." Cash's hand was on the door latch, but he paused, looking back at her over his shoulder. In the morning light streaming through the window, his profile was sharp and beautiful, like something carved from stone. "Because I saw your face yesterday at the chapel. I saw how scared you were, how desperate, and I saw Silverstone looking at you like you were just another thing he'd purchased." His jaw hardened. "And I've seen enough people used and discarded in my life. I wasn't going to stand by and let it happen to you." Before Laura could respond, he was gone, the door closing softly behind him. Laura sat alone in the cabin, listening to the burble of the creek outside, the rustle of cottonwood leaves, the low murmur of voices as Cash spoke with his men. Laura put her head in her hands and finally let the tears come. They were tears of exhaustion and fear and overwhelming confusion, but underneath it all, relief. Because whatever Cash was, spy, warrior, stranger, he had saved her. Outside, Laura heard Cash's voice speaking in what must have been Navajo to one of his men. Then a horse whinnied, and hoofbeats faded into the distance. Laura stood on shaky legs and went to the window. Cash and one of the riders were heading back toward Albuquerque, leaving the third man to stand guard. She watched until they disappeared over the rise.
Chapter 11. Laura went to the small mirror hanging on the wall near the wash basin. What she saw made her wince. Her hair had come completely loose from its pins, hanging in tangled waves around her face. Dust streaked her cheeks and forehead. Her burgundy dress was rumpled and stained, with a tear in the sleeve. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her lips were cracked from the dry air. "Well," she said to her reflection, "you wanted adventure. You certainly look the part now." The absurdity of it struck her, looking like a ragamuffin, talking to herself in the mirror. Her mother would have fainted dead away. Laura found a bucket by the door and stepped outside into the bright afternoon sun. The heat hit her immediately, but here among the trees it was more bearable than it had been in town. The cottonwoods rustled overhead, their leaves creating shifting patterns of light and shadow. Birds she couldn't name sang from the branches, and there, just a few yards from the cabin, the creek bubbled and splashed over smooth stones, the water so clear she could see every pebble on the bottom. It was beautiful, peaceful. Laura scanned the area, looking for her guard. The trees, the rocks, the sweep of desert beyond, all appeared empty, yet she felt eyes on her. "Hello?" she called softly, feeling foolish. I'm going to get some water from the creek." No answer, but she felt certain someone was listening. Laura made her way to the creek's edge, her boots sinking slightly into the soft earth at the bank. She dipped the bucket into the flowing water, marveling at how cold it was despite the desert heat. The current tugged at the bucket, and she had to brace herself to keep from being pulled forward. When she lifted it, full and heavy, water sloshed over the sides and soaked the hem of her dress. She didn't care. The coolness felt wonderful against her dusty skin. As she turned back toward the cabin, she scanned the landscape again. A flash of movement caught her eye. There, in the shadows of a rocky outcropping about 50 yards away, just a slight shift, barely perceptible. Her guardian was there, watching, hidden but present. Back in the cabin, Laura poured some of the cold creek water into the wash basin and set to work cleaning herself up. She found a small piece of soap, rough and unscented but functional, and scrubbed the dust from her face and arms. The water in the basin quickly turned brown. She unpinned her hair completely and tried to work through the tangles with her fingers, wishing desperately for her hairbrush back in her trunk at the hotel. Eventually, she managed to braid it into a single plait that hung down her back. It wasn't elegant, but it was neat enough. Her dress was beyond help without a proper washing, but she did what she could, sponging off the worst of the dirt and dust. There were other clothes in her trunk, but those were in Albuquerque too. With nothing else demanding her attention, Laura found herself at loose ends. The cabin was small enough that exploring it took all of 5 minutes. Besides the bed, table, and stove, there were shelves with supplies, canned goods, coffee, dried beans, flour in a sealed tin, a few cooking implements. The books she'd noticed earlier turned out to be a Bible, a well-worn copy of Robinson Crusoe, and a journal filled with what looked like accounts or records in handwriting she didn't recognize. She opened Robinson Crusoe and tried to read, but her mind wouldn't focus on the words. Her thoughts kept drifting. To Cash. Where was he now? Back in Albuquerque, probably, dealing with Silverstone? What would the arms dealer do when he discovered she was gone? Would he be angry? Suspicious? Would he connect her disappearance to Cash? The thought made her afraid for him in a way that surprised her. She barely knew the man. He'd kidnapped her, for heaven's sake. And yet he'd also saved her, seen her more than a commodity, risked his mission and possibly his life to keep her from being used. Laura set the book aside and moved to the window, staring out at the creek and the cottonwoods beyond. Without meaning to, she found her hands clasped together, her lips moving in silent prayer. Please keep him safe. Please let him come back. Please don't let Silverstone hurt him. She stopped, startled by her own thoughts. When had she started caring about Cash's safety more than her own situation? When had he become Cash in her mind instead of that Navajo man or my kidnapper? The sun moved across the sky, shadows lengthening as afternoon crept toward evening. Laura's stomach began to growl, reminding her that she hadn't eaten since the disastrous dinner with Silverstone the night before. She eyed the supplies on the shelves. She'd never cooked a meal in her life. That had been the cook's domain at her parents' home. How hard could it be? People did it every day. Frontier women did it in conditions far worse than this. She could figure it out. The stove was intimidating, a squat iron beast with a firebox and a flat top for cooking. Laura had seen the cook use the one at home, but she'd never paid close attention to the process. She needed wood first. There was a stack of split logs near the stove, and she carefully arranged a few in the firebox the way she'd seen it done. Then she stared at them, realizing she had no idea how to actually light a fire. Matches. There had to be matches. She found them in a tin on the shelf, wooden matches with red tips. Laura struck one experimentally and jumped when it flared to life, nearly dropping it before remembering to hold it to the wood in the firebox. The wood didn't catch. The match burned down to her fingers and she dropped it with a yelp, sticking her singed fingers in her mouth. 3 more attempts and increasingly colorful language later, Laura finally coaxed a small flame to life among the kindling. She fed it carefully, adding larger pieces of wood, and felt an absurd surge of pride when the fire actually caught and began to burn steadily. She'd made fire. Her, Laura Ashworth, who'd never done a practical thing in her life. She'd made fire. Now what? The canned goods seemed safest. She selected a tin labeled beans and stared at it, trying to figure out how to open it. There was no pull ring like she'd seen on newer cans, just smooth metal. After several minutes of searching, she found a strange implement with a pointed end and a crank handle. It took her several tries and one cut thumb to figure out how to use it, but eventually she managed to open the can, feeling like she'd conquered a small mountain. The beans inside were, well, they were beans, swimming in some kind of sauce that didn't look particularly appetizing, but her stomach was past the point of being particular. She found a small pot and dumped the beans in, setting it on top of the now hot stove. While they heated, and she had no idea how long that should take, she investigated the hardtack. It was in a tin, labeled in faded letters. The biscuits inside were rock hard, nothing like the fluffy biscuits the cook made back home. Laura tapped one experimentally against the table, and it made a sound like wood on wood.
A memory surfaced, something she'd read in one of her frontier novels. Hardtack needed to be softened, either in liquid or by... She eyed the can of beans. Close enough to liquid, wasn't it? Laura dropped 2 pieces of hardtack into the pot with the beans and stirred the whole mess with a wooden spoon. It didn't look like anything she'd ever been served at her parents' table, but it smelled not terrible. Smoky and salty and definitely edible. When she deemed it ready, purely by guessing, she spooned the beans and now softened hardtack into a tin plate and carried it to the table. It was the worst meal she'd ever eaten. The beans were slightly burned on the bottom, over-salted, and the hardtack had the texture of wet cardboard. But she'd made it herself, with her own hands, and she ate every bite. Afterward, she even managed to wash her plate and pot in cold water from the bucket, setting them to dry on a cloth she found. Another small victory. The cabin was growing dark now, the last of the sunlight fading from the windows. Laura lit the oil lamp she found on the shelf, creating a small circle of warm light in the gathering darkness. Outside, the sounds of the desert at night were beginning. Things rustling in the underbrush, the chirp of crickets, a coyote's distant howl that made her shiver despite the lingering heat. Exhaustion was creeping over her now, bone-deep and irresistible. The rope bed looked impossibly inviting. Laura kicked off her boots and lay down fully clothed on top of the blankets. The rope creaked beneath her weight, and the mattress, stuffed with what felt like corn husks, was surprisingly comfortable. Laura closed her eyes, listening to the creak outside, the rustle of cottonwood leaves, the distant sounds of the desert night. Her mind drifted, thoughts fragmenting into images and sensations. Cash's hands on her waist, lifting her from the horse, the warmth of his body pressed against her back during the ride, the way his eyes had looked in the morning light, amber and brown and impossibly deep, his voice in her ear, "Don't scream." She dozed, jerking awake at every unfamiliar sound, the creak of a tree branch, the splash of something in the creek, the call of a night bird.
Each time her heart would race, and she'd lie rigid in the darkness, listening, but nothing came. Her guardian was out there, keeping watch. She was safe. Please let Cash be safe too, she prayed again into the darkness. Please let him come back. The hours crawled past. Laura drifted in and out of a light sleep, never quite surrendering to unconsciousness, always listening. Finally, when the moon was high and the night at its deepest, exhaustion won. Her breathing slowed, her muscles relaxed, and she slipped into true sleep. And she dreamed. She dreamed of riding across the desert with strong arms around her, the horse's hooves eating up the miles. But this time she wasn't frightened. This time she leaned back into the warmth behind her, feeling safe and protected. She dreamed of copper skin and lean muscle and hands that were gentle despite their strength, of a smile that made her heart race and her breath catch. She dreamed of standing in the creek with water swirling around her ankles, and Cash was there, reaching for her, pulling her close. His hands cupped her face, his thumbs stroking her cheeks, and he was leaning down, his lips almost touching hers. Laura woke with a gasp, her heart pounding. The cabin was still dark, the lamp having burned out at some point. Through the window she could see the sky just beginning to lighten, not quite dawn, but close. Her face was hot, her body tingling with sensations she'd never experienced before. The dream had felt so real. She could almost feel Cash's hands on her face, could almost taste his breath. "What is wrong with you?" she asked herself, mortified. "You barely know him. He kidnapped you, and you're lying here dreaming about—" But her mind wouldn't complete the thought, wouldn't acknowledge what exactly she'd been dreaming about, what her sleeping mind had wanted to happen in that dream creek. Laura sat up, pressing her hands to her burning cheeks. This was ridiculous, inappropriate, completely improper. "Good morning."
Chapter 12. Laura jolted upright so violently she nearly fell off the bed, her heart exploding into panicked rhythm. Her hands clutched at the blanket, and she let out a strangled gasp that was almost a scream. A woman stood at the stove. Not just any woman, a Navajo woman, young and impossibly beautiful, moving around the small cabin with the easy familiarity of someone who knew every inch of the space. She was working with the cooking implements, and the smell of bacon filled the air, rich and savory. She was moving about in Cash's cabin like she belonged here, like she lived here. The woman turned and broke into a warm smile. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to startle you. I thought you heard me come in." The woman was perhaps 20 or 21, with smooth copper skin that seemed to glow in the morning light streaming through the window. Her hair was black as a raven's wing, hanging in a thick braid over one shoulder all the way to her waist. She wore a simple dress, not the elaborate Victorian confection Laura had on, but a practical garment of dark blue cotton that somehow made her look elegant despite its simplicity. Silver and turquoise jewelry glinted at her throat and wrists, but it was her face that made Laura feel suddenly, acutely plain. High cheekbones, a straight nose, full lips, and eyes so dark they were almost black, framed by long lashes. "I brought breakfast," the woman said, as if that explained everything. She gestured to the skillet on the stove where the bacon was sizzling. "I thought you might be hungry. White women aren't usually very good at cooking over a wood stove." She said it kindly, without judgment, which somehow made it worse. Laura's face flamed. The disastrous beans and hardtack from last night suddenly felt even more pathetic. "Who are you? Why are you here?" The woman tilted her head slightly, studying Laura with those impossibly dark eyes. "My name is Sarah Redbird, and I live here." The words hit Laura like a physical blow. I live here. This was Cash's cabin. This beautiful woman lived in Cash's cabin, which meant— Oh, God! Laura felt the blood drain from her face. This was Cash's wife, and Laura had been here all night, sleeping in what was probably their bed, while Cash's wife had been— Where? And Laura had been having those dreams, those completely inappropriate dreams about a married man. Cash thought you might need, she paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. Company, someone to talk to. It must be frightening being here alone. That was actually thoughtful, annoyingly thoughtful. Laura didn't want this beautiful woman to be thoughtful. She wanted her to be, well, Laura wasn't sure what she wanted, but it definitely wasn't for Sarah Redbird to be kind and considerate and perfect. I see, Sarah said stiffly. She became suddenly acutely aware of how she must look, her hair in a messy braid, her dress rumpled and stained, still wearing yesterday's clothes because she had nothing else, while Sarah looked fresh and put together. Sarah turned back to the stove, using a fork to flip the bacon with practiced ease. There's coffee, too, and I brought eggs and bread from town, Rio bread, not hardtack. She glanced over her shoulder, and there was definite amusement in her eyes. Cash said you might need proper food. Of course he had, because he'd probably come back last night and seen Laura's pathetic attempt at cooking, and he'd sent his beautiful wife to take care of the helpless white woman who couldn't even boil beans without burning them. Laura wanted to sink through the floor. Instead, she stood on shaky legs and tried to maintain some shred of dignity. That's very kind of you. Thank you. You're welcome. Sarah began plating the food, bacon, scrambled eggs, thick slices of bread. She moved with an economy of motion that spoke of years of practice, utterly at home in the small kitchen space. Laura watched her, feeling increasingly awkward and out of place. This was Sarah's cabin, Sarah's life. Laura was just an unwanted complication, a problem that had forced Cash to interrupt whatever he and his wife had been doing. They ate in uncomfortable silence. At least it was uncomfortable for Laura. Sarah seemed perfectly at ease, eating with good appetite and occasionally glancing at Laura with what might have been curiosity. The food was delicious. Of course it was. Sarah was probably an excellent housekeeper, excellent at everything. The kind of woman who could manage a frontier cabin with grace while also being beautiful enough to stop hearts. So, Sarah said finally, setting down her fork, Cash told me a little about your situation. You came from Virginia to marry John Silverstone? Laura nodded mutely, not trusting her voice. The territory is very different from the East. It takes some getting used to. You speak English very well, Laura said, then immediately cringed at how that sounded, like some patronizing comment from a stuffy Eastern lady. But Sarah just smiled. My father was a missionary. He insisted I learn English and attend the mission school. He thought education was important, even for, she hesitated, even for Navajo girls. There was something in the way she said that made Laura look up, some hint of old pain or frustration. But Sarah's expression was serene, giving nothing away. The day stretched ahead, endless and awkward. Sarah cleaned up after breakfast with efficient movements, then set about tidying the cabin, not that there was much to tidy given how small it was. Laura tried to help, but she kept getting in the way or doing things wrong. Here, Sarah said, taking the blanket Laura was trying to fold. Like this, the corners need to meet evenly. She demonstrated, and Laura felt like a child being taught something any competent adult should already know. They sat outside in the shade of the cottonwoods, where it was marginally cooler than inside the cabin. Sarah brought out mending, a shirt that Laura recognized with a jolt as the one Cash had been wearing yesterday, now with a tear in the sleeve that needed fixing. Of course she mends his clothes, Laura thought, watching Sarah's nimble fingers work the needle and thread with practiced ease. She's his wife. That's what wives do. The jealousy was irrational and inappropriate, and Laura hated herself for feeling it. She had no right to care who mended his shirts, or cooked his meals, or shared his bed in this cabin. He'd saved her from a terrible situation, nothing more. The fact that she'd had one improper dream didn't give her any kind of ownership over him. How long have you and Cash, Laura began, then stopped, not sure how to finish the question. Been married? Lived together? Shared this cabin? Sarah looked up from her mending, her dark eyes unreadable. How long have we what? Known each other, Laura finished lamely. Oh, Sarah's face softened. All our lives, really. Our families have been friends since we were children. Cash's mother and my mother, distant cousins. She smiled at some memory. He used to pull my braids when we were little. I hated him for it.
The casual intimacy of the memory made Laura's chest tight. A lifetime of shared history, of growing up together, of bonds formed in childhood and strengthened over years. What was Laura compared to that? A stranger who'd stumbled into Cash's life through bad luck? "He must care about you very much," Laura said quietly. Sarah's hand stilled on the mending. She looked at Laura with an expression that might have been surprise. "He cares about a lot of people. Cash has always been—" She paused, seeming to search for the right word. "Protective, especially of those who can't protect themselves." The words should have been comforting. Instead, they just reinforced what Laura already knew. Cash had saved her life out of a sense of duty and compassion, not because she was special. She was just another person who needed protecting, another problem to be solved. The hours crawled past. They talked, or rather, Sarah talked, and Laura tried to focus on the conversation instead of the growing knot of anxiety and jealousy in her stomach. Sarah spoke about the territory, about the plants and animals, about Navajo customs and beliefs. She was intelligent and well-educated, with a dry sense of humor that occasionally broke through her reserved demeanor. Under other circumstances, Laura thought she might have liked her, might have even become friends. But every time Sarah mentioned Cash, and she mentioned him often, in casual, comfortable ways that spoke of long familiarity, Laura felt that irrational spike of jealousy. "Cash taught me to shoot when I was 12, Sarah said at one point, showing Laura a scar on her palm from where the rifle had kicked back. "He said I needed to know how to protect myself." Of course he did, Laura thought, because he's noble and protective and probably teaches all the women in his life to shoot. "Cash brought me books from Santa Fe once," Sarah mentioned later. "He knew I loved to read, and books are hard to come by out here." Of course he brought her books. Of course he pays attention to what she loves. As the afternoon wore on and the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Laura's worry began to overwhelm even her jealousy. Where was Cash? He'd left yesterday morning. Surely his business in town shouldn't take this long. What if Silverstone had discovered the deception? What if there had been trouble? What if Cash was hurt or arrested or— Laura couldn't complete the thought. Her hands twisted in her lap, and she found herself staring toward the rise where Cash had disappeared yesterday, willing him to appear. Sarah noticed. Of course she noticed. Those dark eyes saw everything. "He'll come back," she said quietly. "Cash always comes back." Sarah's voice was calm, certain. "He's been doing this kind of work for years. He knows how to handle dangerous men." The sun continued its descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The shadows lengthened, the heat finally beginning to ease. Sarah made supper, some kind of stew with meat and vegetables that smelled wonderful and tasted even better. Laura barely tasted it, too worried to eat. After they cleaned up, Sarah began pulling blankets from a trunk, spreading them on the floor near the stove. "What are you doing?" Laura asked. "Making a sleeping place." Sarah smoothed the blankets with practiced movements. "The bed's not big enough for both of us, so one of us will sleep here." "You can have the bed," Sarah said. "You're a guest. I don't mind the floor." "No, Laura began, but she was interrupted by the sound of hoofbeats outside. Both women froze. Then Laura was on her feet and moving toward the door, her heart pounding. She flung open the door and stepped outside into the twilight. 2 horses were approaching, their riders silhouetted against the darkening sky. Laura recognized Running Deer on one horse, and on the other, Cash.
But something was wrong. He was slumped forward in the saddle, one hand pressed to his left shoulder, and even in the fading light, Laura could see the dark stain spreading across his shirt. Blood. "He's been shot," Running Deer said in accented English as they drew close. "Through the shoulder. The bullet went clean through, but he's lost blood." Sarah was suddenly beside Laura, moving with swift competence. Sarah and Running Deer helped Cash down from the horse. Cash's face was tight with pain, pale beneath his copper skin, his jaw clenched. When his feet hit the ground, his knees buckled slightly. "I'm fine," Cash said, his voice strained. "It's just a scratch." "You're bleeding all over yourself," Sarah said sharply, already moving to support his good side. "That's not a scratch." And all Laura could do was watch, useless and terrified, as they helped Cash toward the cabin, toward her cabin, where his wife would tend his wounds, and Laura would be nothing but an observer, an outsider, a burden they'd all be better off without. Cash's eyes found hers as they passed, and something flickered in his expression. Recognition, maybe, or relief. But then Sarah was speaking to him, her voice sharp with worry and affection, and his attention shifted to her. Laura followed them inside, her heart in her throat, and wondered when exactly she'd become stupid enough to fall for a married man she barely knew, and wondered even more how she was supposed to survive watching her wife take care of him, knowing that Laura had no right to the jealousy burning through her like wildfire. No right at all.
Chapter 13. Running Deer and Sarah half carried, half dragged him to the table, and Sarah swept her arm across its surface with one violent motion. The salt shaker, pepper mill, tin cups, everything went flying, clattering to the floor in a cacophony that made Laura flinch. "Lay him down," Sarah commanded, her voice sharp and controlled, despite the blood staining her hands where she'd been supporting Cash's injured shoulder. They lifted him onto the table, Cash grunting in pain, despite his obvious effort to stay silent, and laid him on his back. In the lamplight, Laura could finally see the full extent of the damage. His shirt was soaked through with blood on the left side, the fabric torn where the bullet had entered. His face was gray, slicked with sweat, his jaw clenched so tight the muscles jumped. But his eyes were open, alert, tracking Sarah's movements as she began barking orders. "Running Deer, get the medical kit from the trunk, the leather satchel, and bring the whiskey, the good bottle, not the cheap stuff." Sarah was already working on Cash's shirt, tearing it open to expose the wound. "You, Laura, I need hot water. Fill the largest pot you can find and get it on the stove, now." Laura jolted into motion, her hands shaking as she grabbed the pot and ran outside to the pump. The night air was cool against her overheated skin, and she could hear her own ragged breathing as she worked the pump handle frantically. "Please don't let him die. Please, God, please don't let him die." The prayer ran through her mind on endless repeat as she lugged the heavy pot back inside and set it on the stove, building up the fire with trembling hands. Behind her, she could hear Sarah and Running Deer working on Cash, their voices low and urgent. "The bullet went through," Sarah was saying. "Clean through," Running Deer confirmed, "but it tore muscle. Lot of damage." "The bleeding is slowing. That's good." Sarah's voice remained steady, professional. "Cash, can you feel your fingers?" "Yes." Cash's voice was strained but clear. "Stop fussing. I've had worse." "You've never been shot before, you idiot. What happened?" "Silverstone got suspicious," he grunted as Sarah probed the wound. "Jesus, could you be a little more gentle?" "No. What questions?" "One of his men must have seen us leaving town. He confronted me. Things got heated. Someone drew a gun." "And you got shot." Sarah's tone was flat, angry. "This is exactly what I was afraid of." "I handled it." "You got shot, Cash. That's not handling it." Laura's hands were still shaking as she watched the water, willing it to heat faster. She wanted to turn around to see what was happening, but she was also terrified of what she might see. The smell of blood was heavy in the air, metallic and sickening. "Water's ready," she called out, her voice thin. "Bring it here, and bring clean cloths. In the trunk, bottom right."
Laura found the cloths and brought everything to the table, then finally allowed herself to look at Cash's wound. She immediately wished she hadn't. The entry wound was a ragged hole in his shoulder, still seeping blood. The exit wound in his back, she could see it when Sarah shifted him slightly, was larger, more torn. The flesh around both wounds was already bruising, turning purple and black. Laura's stomach heaved. "Don't you dare faint," Sarah said sharply, not looking up from her work. "I need you focused. Take these cloths, dip them in the hot water, and hand them to me one at a time when I ask." Laura nodded mutely, grateful to have something to do with her shaking hands. Running Deer returned with the medical kit and a bottle of whiskey. Sarah uncorked the bottle and held it to Cash's lips. "Drink, this is gonna hurt." "I'm fine. Drink!" Cash drank, grimacing at the burn. Then Sarah was pouring the whiskey directly into the wound, and Cash's entire body went rigid, his hands fisting in the blanket they'd spread beneath him. A sound escaped between his clenched teeth, not quite a scream, but close. I know, Sarah murmured, her voice gentling slightly. "I'm sorry, but it has to be cleaned." She worked with swift, sure movements, using the hot water and cloths Laura handed her to clean away the blood and debris from both the entry and exit wounds. Cash's breathing was harsh and ragged, but he didn't cry out again. Laura watched in horrified fascination as Sarah pulled out a pair of tweezers from the medical kit and began probing the wound. "There's cloth in there, from your shirt. It has to come out." What followed was the longest 5 minutes of Laura's life. Sarah used the tweezers to carefully extract bits of fabric from the torn flesh, while Cash lay rigid on the table, sweat pouring down his face, his knuckles white where he gripped the edge of the wood. Almost done. You're doing good, Cash." Finally, she set the tweezers aside, now stained with blood, and surveyed her work. The wound was clean, still bleeding sluggishly, but no longer gushing. "It needs to be closed," Sarah said. "Laura, hand me the needle and thread from the kit, the curved one with the thick thread." Laura found the needle, a wicked-looking thing designed for exactly this kind of work, and the thick black thread. She handed them over, then watched as Sarah threaded the needle with steady hands. Sarah looked up then, catching Laura's eye. There was something assessing in her gaze, something measuring. "Do you want to do it?" she asked. "What?" "Sew him up. Do you want to do it?" Sarah held out the threaded needle. "It's not difficult, just like embroidery, except the fabric is flesh." The casual way she said it, the matter-of-fact tone, combined with the smell of blood and whiskey and the sight of Cash's torn flesh, was too much. Laura's stomach heaved violently. She clapped both hands over her mouth and ran for the door. She made it outside just in time to be violently sick in the bushes beside the cabin, her whole body shaking. She heaved until there was nothing left, then sank to her knees in the dirt, gasping for air.
Behind her, she could hear voices from the cabin. Sarah speaking in low, soothing tones, Cash's occasional grunt of pain. The medical work was continuing without her. Useless, she thought bitterly. Completely useless. Sarah's in there saving his life, and you're out here being sick like a child. After several minutes, Laura managed to stand on shaky legs. She rinsed her mouth with water from the creek, splashed her face, and stood in the darkness trying to compose herself. By the time she made it back inside, it was done. Cash lay on the table, his shoulder now neatly stitched, 2 rows of black thread holding the torn flesh together, front and back. A clean bandage was being wrapped around his torso by Sarah's practiced hands. "Help us move him to the bed," Sarah said when she saw Laura. Her tone was neutral, neither accusatory nor sympathetic, just stating a task that needed doing. Together, Sarah, Running Deer, and Laura, they managed to get Cash off the table and onto the rope bed. He was conscious, but clearly exhausted, his face pale and drawn. Once he was settled, Sarah pulled a blanket over him and placed her hand briefly on his forehead, checking for fever. "Rest," she told him firmly. "I'll check on you through the night." "Yes, ma'am," Cash murmured, his eyes already drifting closed. Running Deer left shortly after, disappearing into the night to resume his watch. Sarah began cleaning up the medical supplies, her movements efficient and methodical. Laura tried to help, moving in a daze as she wiped blood from the table and gathered the scattered items from the floor. When the cabin was finally restored to some semblance of order, Sarah turned to Laura. Her face was tired, smudged with dirt and a streak of blood on her cheek that she'd missed. "You'll have to sleep on the mat after all," Sarah said quietly, gesturing to the blanket still spread on the floor. "I need to stay beside him tonight, in case the fever comes or if the bleeding starts again." Laura looked at the rope bed where Cash lay, his chest rising and falling with shallow breaths, then back at Sarah. "Of course," Laura managed. Sarah gave her a long look, something unreadable in those dark eyes, but said nothing. She simply moved to the bed, sitting carefully on the edge so as not to jostle Cash's injured shoulder. Laura turned away and lay down on the mat, pulling the blanket over herself. It was surprisingly comfortable, but Laura barely noticed. She stared at the dark ceiling, listening to Sarah's quiet movements as she settled beside Cash, the creak of the rope bed, Cash's labored breathing. This was how it would be. Sarah tending her husband, Laura relegated to the floor, an outsider in their home, in their life. It made Laura want to cry. She closed her eyes and tried to sleep, but sleep wouldn't come. Every sound from the bed made her tense. She heard Sarah moving periodically, probably checking his bandages, feeling for fever. The whisper of cloth, the soft pad of bare feet on the wooden floor when Sarah rose to wet a cloth in the basin. When Laura woke several hours later, sunlight was streaming through the windows and the cabin smelled of coffee. Sarah was at the stove, her hair neatly braided, her dress fresh. She looked like she'd slept soundly, though Laura knew she couldn't have. Cash was still asleep, his chest rising and falling with deeper and even breaths than it had been during the night. "Morning," Sarah said quietly, not looking up from the coffee she was pouring. "There's water heated if you want to wash up." "How is he?" Laura asked, sitting up and pushing her tangled hair back from her face. "Better than I expected. No fever yet. The bleeding stopped completely." Sarah finally looked at her, and there was something like approval in her expression. "He's strong. He'll recover." The relief that flooded through Laura was so intense it made her dizzy. "Thank God." "Yes," Sarah agreed softly. "Thank God." The pattern was set that first night and continued over the days that followed. Sarah slept beside Cash, monitoring him through the night. Laura took the mat on the floor. During the day, Sarah tended the wound, while Laura ran errands and helped where she could. Cash drifted in and out of fever on the second day. Sarah was there every time he stirred, cooling his face with damp cloths, getting him to sip water, speaking to him in low, soothing tones, sometimes in English, sometimes in Navajo. Laura would watch from across the cabin, feeling helpless and useless and burning with a jealousy she had no right to feel. On the third day, the fever broke. Cash woke clear-headed and demanding food, which Sarah declared a good sign. "If he's annoying, he's healing," she said with dry humor, spooning broth into his mouth despite his protests that he could feed himself. "I can hold a damn spoon," Cash grumbled. "Not with that shoulder you can't. Now open up." Laura had turned away, unable to watch the domestic intimacy of it. In the evenings, after Cash had been fed and his bandages changed, and he'd drifted off to sleep, Laura would slip outside to sit by the creek. She loved the sound of the water bubbling over stones, the rustle of cottonwood leaves, the way the light slanted through the branches in the late afternoon, painting everything gold, the occasional glimpse of wildlife, a fox drinking from the creek, a hawk circling overhead, lizards sunning themselves on the rocks. Sarah appeared with 2 cups of coffee and settled on a rock nearby, handing one to Laura. They sat in silence for a while, sipping their drinks and watching the last light fade from the sky. Over the past few days, Laura had settled into an uneasy acceptance of the situation. Sarah was Cash's husband. That was the reality, and fighting it or resenting it wouldn't change anything. Better to squash whatever inappropriate feelings had been budding and focus on survival, on figuring out her future, on being grateful for the help she'd received rather than pining after a married man she had no right to even think about. "He's going to be okay," Sarah said finally, breaking the silence. "Cash, he'll make a full recovery." "Only because of you," Laura said quietly. "You're very good at doctoring. He's lucky to have you."
Sarah was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was serious, almost grave. Plenty of practice with bullet wounds. Too much practice.
Chapter 14. Cash was on his feet by the 6th day, against Sarah's strenuous objections. "You're going to tear those stitches," she warned, watching him pace the small cabin like a caged animal. "Sit down before you—" "I'm fine." Cash rotated his shoulder carefully, wincing only slightly. "It's stiff, but it's healing. I need to move, Sarah. I've been lying around long enough." "It's been less than a week since you were shot." "I can't just hide in this cabin forever." Laura sat at the table mending one of Cash's shirts. She'd learned over the past week that when Cash set his mind to something, even Sarah's formidable will couldn't deter him. "At least let me check the wound," Sarah said, finally, admitting defeat. Cash unwrapped the bandage, studied the stitches with a critical eye, and finally nodded. "It's healing well, better than I expected, actually." She began rewrapping it with clean cloth. "But if you do anything stupid and tear these stitches open, I'm not sewing you back together. I'll let you bleed." "Duly noted." Cash's lips quirked in amusement. "Has anyone ever told you that you're terrifying when you're worried?" "Frequently." Sarah tied off the bandage with more force than strictly necessary. "Usually by idiots who don't know when to rest." The easy familiarity between them still made Laura's chest tight, even though she'd resigned herself to it. She bent her head over her mending, trying to ignore the pang of jealousy. She'd gotten better at it over the past week. The constant ache had dulled to something more manageable. Almost. "I need to get back to town," Cash said, shrugging carefully into a clean shirt. "Running Deer brought word yesterday that Silverstone is getting nervous. We need to move on him soon, before he bolts." "Or before he shoots you again," Sarah said dryly. "That too." Cash buckled his gun belt, checking the revolver with practiced ease. Then he looked at Laura, and his expression grew serious. "I need to talk to you, outside." Laura's heart jumped into her throat. She set down her mending with trembling hands and followed him out into the afternoon sunlight. They walked to the creek, and Cash leaned against a cottonwood tree, favoring his injured shoulder slightly. "Silverstone thinks you've run away, and someone is hiding you. I need your help." "My help?" "Silverstone thinks you're just a scared Eastern girl who ran away from her wedding. That makes you perfect bait." The word hit her like a slap. "Bait?" "Hear me out." Cash pushed off from the tree, turning to face her fully. "Silverstone has a meeting tomorrow night, a big one. His suppliers, his buyers, everyone in the network will be there. It's our best chance to catch them all at once. We let Silverstone find you, let him think he's won, that he's getting his respectable bride back after all. He'll be so pleased with himself, so confident, that he won't see the trap closing around him." Laura stared at him, her mind racing. "You want me to go back to him? To Silverstone?" "Not really go back, just let him think he've captured you. My men and I will be there the whole time. You won't be in any real danger." "Won't be in any real danger?" Laura's voice rose despite her effort to stay calm. "I'll be there," Cash said quietly. "I won't let anything happen to you, I promise." Cash reached out and took her hand, and the contact sent a shock through her entire body. His palm was warm and calloused, his grip gentle but firm. "I know what I'm asking. I know it's terrifying, and I know you have every right to say no. But Laura, this is our one chance to stop Silverstone. I can't do it without you." Laura looked down at their joined hands, then up at his face. His eyes were serious, pleading, but also certain. He believed what he was saying. He believed he could keep her safe. And God help her, she believed him too. "What would I have to do?" she asked quietly. The plan was simple, which Cash assured her was a good thing. Simple plans had fewer places to go wrong. Laura wasn't sure she agreed.
She would go into town with Running Deer, who would pretend to be selling her to the highest bidder, a common enough occurrence in the rough frontier settlements. Word would reach Silverstone, as it was meant to. He would come to claim his property, probably with his men, and when he took her to the meeting location, Cash and the other federal agents would be waiting.
Simple, straightforward, absolutely terrifying. "You'll be wearing this," Sarah said, holding up a small Derringer pistol. "It's loaded with 2 shots. Keep it hidden in your skirt pocket. If anything goes wrong, if Cash can't get to you, you use this." Mara took the small gun with shaking hands. It was surprisingly heavy for something so small, cold metal that promised violence. "I've never shot a gun before." "Point and pull the trigger. It's not complicated." Sarah's expression was serious. "But Laura, don't use it unless you absolutely have to. And if you do use it, make the shots count. 2 bullets, that's all you have." The weight of the weapon in her pocket was a constant reminder of the danger as Running Deer drove the wagon into Albuquerque the next afternoon. Laura wore a simple dress, one Sarah had provided, and her hair was deliberately mussed, her face smudged with dirt. She was supposed to look like she'd been living rough, which wasn't far from the truth. "Remember," Running Deer said in his accented English as the town came into view, "you are afraid, but not too afraid. You want to escape, but you are tired, beaten down. He needs to believe you have no fight left." Laura nodded, not trusting her voice. Her heart was hammering so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. They stopped at a saloon on the edge of town, not the Palace Hotel where she'd stayed before, but a rougher establishment where Running Deer said such transactions commonly took place. Laura waited in the wagon, her hands clenched in her lap, while Running Deer went inside. She didn't have to wait long. Within minutes, Running Deer and another man, a rough-looking character with a scar across his cheek, came out of the hotel and approached. He looked Laura over with calculating eyes. "That her? The bride that ran off?" Running Deer nodded. "Found her trying to get to Santa Fe. Thought you might pay to get her back." "Might." The man circled the wagon, studying Laura from all angles. She kept her eyes down, playing the part of a defeated captive. "Boss'll want to see her first, make sure she's who you say she is." "She is. Look at her hair, yellow like wheat. How many women you see with hair like that around here?" The man grunted acknowledgement. "Wait here." He disappeared back into the saloon. Laura forced herself to breathe steadily, to not let the panic show on her face. "Cash is here somewhere," she reminded herself, "watching, waiting." The man returned with 2 others, and Laura's blood ran cold. One of them was Silverstone. He looked different than she remembered, harder, meaner, with none of the false charm he'd shown at their dinner. His eyes were cold as he approached the wagon, and when he grabbed her chin and forced her face up to look at him, his fingers dug in painfully. "Well, well," he said softly, "my runaway bride. I've been looking for you, Laura." The sound of her name in his mouth made her skin crawl. She tried to pull away, but his grip tightened. "Where have you been hiding?" He studied her face, and he saw suspicion in his eyes. "Who helped you run?" No one," Laura stammered, putting genuine fear into her voice because it was there anyway, begging to be released. "I wanted to go home." "Home to Virginia?" His smile was cruel. "That's a long way, sweetheart. How were you planning to get there with no money?" "I found her on the road to Santa Fe. She offered me money to take her there, but she had no money to give, so I brought her here instead." "Is that so?" Silverstone released Laura's chin and turned to Running Deer. "And how much do you want for her?" $50. Silverstone laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. $50 for a used bride who's been God knows where for a week? I don't think so. Then I take her to Santa Fe, sell her there instead. You could try, but I think you'll find the law very interested in a Navajo kidnapping a white woman.
Silverstone's hand moved to the gun at his hip. Or we could do this another way. You give me the girl, and I don't shoot you where you stand. He gestured to his men. Get her down from there. Rough hands grabbed Laura, dragging her from the wagon. She stumbled, and someone shoved her forward towards Silverstone. He caught her arm in a bruising grip. You and I are going to have a long talk, he said quietly, his breath hot against her ear. And then we're going to have a wedding, after all. Mr. Silverstone, please. Shut up. He dragged her down the street, away from the saloon, away from Running Deer. His men followed. Laura looked back desperately. Where are we going? Somewhere private, where we can talk without interruption. He steered her towards a small building at the edge of town, an old warehouse, abandoned and dark. I want to know who's been helping you. That Navajo who took you from the hotel? Was it him? Cash? Her heart stopped. I don't know anyone named... Don't lie to me. Silverstone shoved her through the warehouse door, and she stumbled in the darkness. I know he was involved. I know he's been asking questions about me, and I know you disappeared right after you met him. I ran away on my own, Laura insisted, backing away from him. Her hand slipped into her pocket, finding the small derringer. You're lying. Silverstone advanced on her, and Laura could see madness in his eyes. Cash is working against me, him and those other Navajo. They're trying to shut down my business, and you're part of it somehow. I'm not. I don't know anything about your business. Then why did you run? He grabbed her shoulders, shaking her. The warehouse door slammed open.
Chapter 15. Cash stood silhouetted in the doorway, his gun drawn, 3 other men behind him, white men in federal uniforms. Not Running Deer, not Navajo warriors, federal marshals. Step away from her, Silverstone. Cash's voice was cold, deadly calm. Silverstone spun, keeping Laura between himself and Cash like a shield. His hand moved to his gun, pressing the barrel against Laura's ribs. I don't think so, he said. I think I'm going to walk out of here with my bride, and you're going to let me. Cash's eyes met Laura's across the dim warehouse. She saw calculation there, saw him measuring distances, angles, possibilities. You shoot her, you're a dead man, Cash said, and you know it. Maybe, but she'll still be dead. Silverstone's grip tightened on Laura, the gun digging painfully into her side. So here's what's gonna happen. You're gonna put down your weapons and back away, all of you, and then I'm gonna leave with the girl. And then what? Cash hadn't moved, his gun still trained on Silverstone. Where are you gonna go? Your operation is finished. We've been watching you for months. We know about your suppliers in Mexico, your buyers among the Apache, your warehouse full of stolen army rifles. We have enough evidence to hang you. Your men are already being rounded up. The meeting tonight? Federal marshals are waiting at the location right now. Everyone who shows up is going to be arrested. His eyes never left Silverstone's face. It's over. You've lost. Let her go. No! Silverstone's voice rose to a shout. He was distracted, just for a second, his attention on Cash, his grip on Laura loosening slightly. Laura remembered Sarah's words, if anything goes wrong, you use this. She pulled the derringer from her pocket and fired. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space. The bullet caught Silverstone in the leg, and his gun went off, the shot going wild, hitting the ceiling. He staggered, his grip on Laura releasing, and she threw herself forward, away from him. Cash was moving before she hit the ground. He fired once, a clean shot to Silverstone's gun hand, sending the weapon spinning across the floor. The other marshals rushed in, tackling Silverstone as he tried to run despite his wounded leg. And then Cash was there, hauling Laura to her feet, his hands on her shoulders, his eyes searching her face. Are you hurt? Did he... I'm fine. I'm shaking so hard I could barely stand. I'm fine. I shot him. I actually shot him. You did. Cash's hands moved from her shoulders to cup her face, his thumbs brushing her cheeks. You were so brave, so incredibly brave.
The marshals were hauling Silverstone away, the man screaming threats and curses. Laura could hear running footsteps outside, more men arriving, the sounds of arrests being made. But all she could focus on was Cash's hands on her face, his eyes locked on hers. I was so scared. I thought, when he took me away from the saloon, I thought the plan had failed, that you wouldn't... I was there the whole time, following, waiting for the right moment. His voice was rough with emotion. I wasn't going to let him hurt you. I swore I'd keep you safe. You did. You kept your promise. They stood like that for a long moment, oblivious to the chaos around them, the marshals securing the warehouse, Running Deer appearing in the doorway, someone calling for a doctor for Silverstone's wounds. Then Cash did something that made Laura's heart stop. He leaned down and kissed her forehead, soft and gentle and achingly tender. "Let's get you out of here," he murmured against her skin. "Let's take you home. Home. To the cabin by the creek. To Sarah, waiting to make sure they both came back safe. To Sarah, who was Cash's wife." The reminder was like cold water, dousing the warmth that had been building in Laura's chest. She stepped back, putting distance between them, trying to ignore the way Cash's hands fell away reluctantly. "Yes," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "Let's go home." But even as she said it, she knew that cabin could never truly be her home, not when it belonged to Cash and Sarah, not when she was just a temporary guest in someone else's life. They rode back to the cabin in silence, Laura seated in front of Cash on his horse, his uninjured arm around her waist to keep her steady. She could feel the warmth of his body against her back, could feel his breath stirring her hair, and every moment of contact was exquisite torture. "Stop it," she told herself fiercely. "He's married. You just went through a traumatic experience and you're confused. That's all this is, confusion." But her treacherous heart knew better. When they reached the cabin, Sarah was waiting on the porch, relief flooding her face when she saw them both safe. "Thank God," she breathed, coming down the steps. "I was so worried when Running Deer came back without you." "We had a slight complication, but it's handled. Silverstone is in custody, along with most of his network." "Most?" Sarah's eyes sharpened. "Not all?" "A few got away, but we got the important ones. The operation is finished." Cash rubbed his injured shoulder absently. "And I think Laura might have cracked a rib or two. I'll check her." "I'll do it," Sarah said quickly. "You need to rest. You've been riding all day with a bullet wound that's barely healed." She ushered Laura inside, leaving Cash on the porch with Running Deer. In the lamplight of the cabin, Sarah examined Laura with gentle, competent hands. "Just bruised," she pronounced finally. "No cracked ribs. You'll be sore for a few days, but nothing serious." She paused, studying Laura's face. "You did well today. Running Deer told me what you did, shooting Silverstone. That took courage." "Or stupidity," Laura said with a weak laugh. "I'm not sure which." "Courage." Sarah's voice was firm. "Stupidity would have been freezing up and doing nothing." She handed Laura a cup of water. Laura drank obediently, then looked at Sarah, this beautiful, competent, brave woman who had saved Cash's life and welcomed Laura into her home and never once made her feel unwanted, even though she must have known that Laura was half in love with her husband. Sarah sat down across from her, folding her hands in her lap. "Laura, there's something I need to tell you, something I should have explained days ago, but the timing never seemed right." Laura's stomach tightened. "What is it?"
"I'm not Cash's wife." The words hung in the air between them, impossible and earth-shaking. Laura stared at Sarah, certain she'd misheard. "What?" "I'm not married to Cash." Sarah's lips curved in a small smile. "I'm married to his brother, Joseph. We live in town. Joseph runs a trading post there. Cash asked me to come stay at the cabin to help with you because he knew you'd be frightened and confused, and he thought a woman's presence might help." The room tilted sideways. Laura gripped the edge of the table to steady herself. But you said you lived here. You said—" "I said I know the cabin well, which I do. Cash and Joseph built it together years ago. It was supposed to be Cash's home, but he's hardly ever here. His work keeps him traveling." Laura's mind was reeling, trying to reorganize everything she'd assumed over the past week. The way you talked about him, the way you cared for him, I thought, I love Cash like a brother, because he is my brother, by marriage, if not by blood. We've known each other since we were children, and yes, I worry about him constantly because what he does is dangerous, but I worry about him the way you'd worry about family, not the way a wife worries about her husband. But you slept beside him, in the bed. Because I'm a nurse, and he was badly injured, and I needed to monitor him through the night. Sarah's expression was patient, understanding. Laura, if you'd asked, I would have explained, but you never asked. Because Laura had been too busy nursing her inappropriate jealousy and trying to squash her feelings for a man she thought was married to another woman. I'm an idiot, Laura said faintly. You're not an idiot. You made assumptions based on what you saw. That's natural. Sarah stood, moving toward the door. But now that you know the truth, I think there are some things you and Cash need to discuss, things I shouldn't be present for. Sarah slipped out the door and closed it softly behind her. Laura sat alone in the cabin, her mind spinning. Everything she'd been telling herself for the past week, all the reasons she couldn't feel what she was feeling, evaporated like morning mist. The door opened again, and Cash stepped inside. He looked tired, his face shadowed with exhaustion and pain, his injured shoulder held stiffly, but his eyes were clear and bright as they found hers. Sarah said you needed to rest, he said. I'm fine. Laura stood, her legs unsteady. Cash, Sarah just told me, she said she's not my wife, I know. He moved toward her slowly, carefully, like approaching a frightened animal. I should have explained from the beginning, but things kept happening, and there never seemed to be a good time, and He stopped, just a few feet away from her. Not sure it mattered? Laura's voice rose despite her effort to stay calm. I spent a week thinking you were married, thinking that these feelings I was having were... She stopped, horrified at what she'd almost admitted. But Cash's expression had changed, softened, become something warm and hopeful that made her heart race. What feelings? He asked quietly. Laura looked away, her face burning. It doesn't matter. It matters to me. He closed the distance between them, his hand coming up to gently turn her face back to his. Laura, look at me, please. She forced herself to meet his eyes. What feelings? He asked again. And Laura, who was raised to be proper and demure and to never speak of such things, found herself blurting out the truth, that I was falling in love with you, that every time you looked at me or touched me or spoke to me, my heart felt like it might burst, that watching Sarah take care of you was torture because I wanted it to be me, that I had no right to any of these feelings because you were married and I was just some foolish girl who'd gotten in over her head. Cash's hand cupped her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. You're not foolish, Laura said softly. You're the bravest, most remarkable woman I've ever met. You traveled across the country to escape a life you didn't want. You shot an armed dealer to save yourself, and you've been facing impossible situations with more courage than most men I know. I've been terrified the entire time. Courage isn't the absence of fear, Laura. It's doing what needs to be done despite the fear. His other hand came up to frame her face, and Laura's breath caught at the tenderness in his expression. And for what it's worth, you're not the only one who's been falling. I wasn't supposed to care about you. You were just supposed to be a complication I had to manage. But then I met you, and you looked at me with those blue eyes, and you were so scared but trying so hard to be brave, and He stopped, swallowed hard. I knew I was in trouble. Laura's heart was pounding so hard she thought he must be able to hear it. What are you saying? I'm saying that I'm in love with you too, have been since I pulled you off that horse, and you looked at me like you were either my salvation or my doom, and you weren't sure which. His hand traced her cheekbone.
I'm saying that watching you sleep in that bed while I was lying across the cabin was torture, that seeing you learn to cook and pump water and be so proud of yourself made me want things I had no business wanting, that the thought of putting you on a train back to Virginia makes me want to lock the door and never let you leave. Then don't, Laura whispered. Don't put me on a train. Don't send me away. Laura, you don't know what you're saying. Life out here, it's not what you're used to. It's hard and dangerous. It's mine, Laura said. Her hands came up to cover his where they cupped her face. For the first time in my life, I get to choose, and I choose this. I choose you. I choose the cabin and the creek and learning to cook terrible beans and being terrified and brave all at once. Her voice caught. I choose love over safety, adventure over comfort, you over everyone else. Cash's expression transformed, wonder and joy and something almost like pain mixing together. Are you sure? Because once I kiss you, Laura, I'm not letting you go. I'm going to marry you properly and keep you here with me and love you for the rest of your life. Then kiss me, Laura said, please. And he did. His lips met hers softly at first, tentative and questioning, giving her every chance to pull away. But Laura had no intention of pulling away. She leaned into him, her hand sliding up his chest to loop around his neck, and kissed him back with all the pent-up longing of the past week. Cash made a sound low in his throat and deepened the kiss, his arms coming around her waist to pull her close. Laura felt like she was drowning, like she was flying, like every romance novel she'd ever read was a pale imitation of this feeling of being cherished and desired and chosen. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Cash rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me," he whispered, "not because you have to, not because you're running from something, but because you want to. Marry me and build a life with me out here." "Yes," Laura said, laughing through tears. "Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes."
Chapter 16. The telegram arrived 3 months after Silverstone's arrest. Cash read it twice, his expression unreadable, then handed it to Laura without a word. She scanned the official government letterhead, the formal language, and felt her heart leap into her throat. Agent Cash Redbird, stop. Your presence requested. Washington, D.C., stop. President wishes to commend service, stop. Ceremony scheduled October 15th, stop. Attendance mandatory, stop. Washington, Laura breathed, looking up from the telegram. They want you to go to Washington. Apparently. Cash was quiet for a moment, his arms around her waist, his chin resting on top of her head. They'd been married for 2 weeks now, a simple ceremony at the chapel in Albuquerque, with Sarah and Joseph as witnesses, followed by a quiet celebration at the cabin. Laura wore a simple dress of blue cotton that Sarah had helped her make, and Cash had picked wildflowers for her bouquet. It had been nothing like the elaborate Virginia wedding her mother had planned, and it had been absolutely perfect. "Will you come with me?" Cash asked quietly. "To Washington?" 4 weeks later, the ceremony was scheduled for the following afternoon. That gave Cash and Laura 1 night to rest, 1 morning to prepare, and, if Laura could work up the courage, time to send word to her parents. She sat at the writing desk in their hotel room that evening, staring at a blank piece of stationery. What did you say to parents you'd abandoned months ago? How did you explain running away, nearly marrying a criminal, and ending up married to a government agent they'd never met? Dear Mother and Father, I know you must have worried about me terribly, and for that I am deeply sorry. I am writing to tell you that I am safe, healthy, and happily married. The words looked inadequate on the page. Laura crumpled the paper and tried again. Dearest Mother and Father, please forgive me for the pain I must have caused you. I am well and living in New Mexico territory. I would very much like to see you and introduce you to my husband. Worse. She crumpled that one too. Cash came up behind her, his hands settling on her shoulders.
Having trouble? I don't know what to say. How do you tell your parents that everything they planned for you didn't matter because you chose something completely different? You tell them the truth. Cash's hands began kneading the tense muscles of her shoulders. That you made your own choice and you're happy. If they love you, and I believe they do, that should be enough. Laura leaned back against him, drawing strength from his solid presence. You make it sound so simple. It is simple. Not easy, but simple. He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. Want me to write it? You? Write to my parents? Why not? I can be very eloquent when I put my mind to it. Despite her anxiety, Laura laughed. All right, let's see this eloquence. Cash took the pen from her hand and pulled a fresh sheet of paper toward him. His handwriting was surprisingly neat, his phrasing direct but respectful. Senator and Mrs. Ashworth, my name is Cash Redbird. I am writing to inform you that your daughter, Laura, is safe, well, and currently in Washington with me. We were married in New Mexico Territory 3 weeks ago. I understand this news may come as a shock and that you have many questions. Laura would very much like to see you and explain everything in person. We are staying at the Willard Hotel and will be in Washington for the next 3 days. If you are willing to meet with us, please send word to the hotel. If not, we understand and will respect your wishes. Respectfully, Cash Redbird. Laura read it over his shoulder, then looked up at him with wonder. That's perfect. Honest, respectful, and to the point. I told you I could be eloquent. He sealed the letter and handed it to her. Send it tonight. Give them time to decide before the ceremony tomorrow. Laura took the letter to the front desk herself, asking that it be delivered to her parents' address immediately. Then she returned to their room and tried not to think about what their response might be, or if they would respond at all. The White House was even more imposing than Laura remembered from the few times she had visited as a child. White columns gleamed in the October sunshine, and the building seemed to radiate power and history. Cash stood beside her on the steps, his new suit impeccable, his bearing straight and proud, despite his obvious discomfort with the formal clothing. "Ready?" she asked, taking his hand. "As I'll ever be." They were ushered into an ornate reception room where other medal recipients and their families waited. Military officers in dress uniforms, government officials in their finest, wives in silk gowns and elaborate hats. Laura wore a dress Sarah had helped her make before they left, deep green silk that brought out her eyes, simple but elegant. She felt plain next to the other ladies with their jewels and feathers, but Cash had told her she looked beautiful, and that was enough. A government official approached, consulting a list. "Agent Redbird?" "Yes, sir."
The president will see you shortly. He's asked for a private audience before the public ceremony if you're amenable. Cash glanced at Laura, who nodded encouragement. Of course. They were led through a series of hallways, all gleaming wood and expensive paintings and the weight of power, until they reached a smaller, more intimate office. And there, rising from behind a massive desk, was President Ulysses S. Grant himself. Laura had seen photographs, of course, but they didn't capture the presence of the man, the weathered face, the intense eyes, the bearing of someone who'd commanded armies and shaped the nation's fate. "Agent Redbird," Grant said, coming around the desk to shake Cash's hand. "I've been looking forward to meeting you. Your work in New Mexico has been exemplary." "Thank you, Mr. President. It's an honor." Grant's eyes moved to Laura, and his expression warmed. "And you must be the famous Mrs. Redbird. I've heard quite a story about your role in apprehending John Silverstone." Laura felt her face heat. "I only did what was necessary, sir." "You shot an armed criminal to protect yourself and aid in his capture. That's considerably more than necessary," Grant smiled. "Your bravery is a credit to your husband and your country." The public ceremony was a blur of speeches and applause.
Cash stood at attention while the president pinned a medal to his chest. The Medal of Honor, the nation's highest military decoration, even though Cash wasn't technically military. Grant spoke about the importance of the work against arms trafficking, about the lives saved by the capture of Silverstone's network, about the courage required to operate undercover among dangerous men. Laura watched from the audience, her heart swelling with pride. This was her husband, this brave, remarkable man who'd risked everything to stop criminals and save lives. And somehow, impossibly, he'd chosen her. After the ceremony, there was a reception. Laura found herself surrounded by dignitaries and their wives, all asking about her adventure out west, about what it was like to shoot a criminal, about life in the territory. She answered as best she could, trying to balance honesty with the polite deflection her mother had taught her. And then, across the crowded room, she saw them, her parents. Her mother stood ramrod straight in a gown of deep blue silk, her dark hair swept up in an elaborate style, her face a careful mask of composure. Her father beside her in his best suit, his silver hair immaculate, his expression unreadable. They'd come. Despite everything, they'd come. Laura's hand found Cash's automatically, squeezing hard. He followed her gaze and tensed. "Your parents?" "Yes." "Want me to come with you?" "Please." They crossed the room together, Laura's heart pounding so hard she thought she might be sick. Her mother saw her first, and something cracked in that perfect composure. Her hand flew to her mouth, her eyes filling with tears. "Laura," Constance whispered. "Oh my God, Laura!" Then her mother was moving, closing the distance between them, pulling Laura into a fierce embrace that smelled of lavender and felt like coming home and breaking apart all at once. "I'm sorry, Mama." Laura was crying too, clutching her mother like she was drowning. "I'm so sorry. I had to leave. I couldn't marry him. I just couldn't." I know, darling." Her mother pulled back, hands framing Laura's face, studying her like she couldn't quite believe she was real. "When we got your letter, when we read that you were here, that you were married." She stopped, her eyes moving past Laura to where Cash stood, hanging back slightly to give them space. Laura took a shaky breath and reached for Cash's hand, pulling him forward. "Mama, Father, this is my husband, Cash Redbird." Cash stepped forward and gave a small bow, perfectly proper despite his nervousness. "Senator Ashworth, Mrs. Ashworth, it's an honor to meet you." Laura's father, who had remained silent through the reunion, studied Cash with the assessing gaze he normally reserved for political opponents. His eyes took in Cash's copper skin, his dark hair, the Medal of Honor pinned to his chest. "You're the government agent," Edmund said finally. "The one who took down the Silverstone operation?" "Yes, sir." "And you married my daughter?" It wasn't quite a question, but not quite a statement either. "I did, sir, 3 weeks ago in Albuquerque." The silence stretched, painful and heavy. Laura felt her mother's hand on her arm, felt Cash's tension beside her. Everything balanced on this moment, acceptance or rejection, reconciliation or rupture. Then her father did something Laura never expected. He smiled. "Well," Thomas said, extending his hand to Cash, "it's suppose that's better than her marrying Ledgehopper. That man was an absolute bore." Cash shook his hand, looking slightly stunned. "Thank you, sir." "Don't thank me yet. I have questions, many, many questions about exactly how my daughter ended up married to a government agent in New Mexico territory." Edmund's expression turned stern. "And you're going to answer all of them. But first," he pulled Laura into a hug, and his voice cracked slightly. "First, I need to hold my daughter and thank God she's alive and safe." Laura clung to her father, feeling years of tension and fear and uncertainty melting away. They weren't angry. They weren't going to disown her or refuse to accept Cash or force her to come home. Constance looked at Cash, her gaze sharp and assessing. "You are happy, aren't you, darling?" Laura looked at Cash, her husband, her choice, her future, and smiled. "Happier than I've ever been in my life." "Then that's settled." Constance tucked her handkerchief away and straightened her shoulders, her composure returning. "Now, I believe we have much to discuss. Laura, Cash, you'll come to dinner tonight, both of you. I want to hear everything, and I do mean everything." "We'd be honored, Mrs. Ashworth." Maybe there was a way to have both, the family she'd been born into and the life she'd chosen. Maybe she didn't have to choose between her past and her future. Maybe, just maybe, Laura could have it all.